Robin Hood of the 21st century. Instead of Sherwood Forest, he operated in a gated community in Florida. Instead of a horse, he maneuvered through the city streets in a luxurious Mercedes. But what would remain unchanged is his assistance to those who are far less fortunate in life. And so it continued until one fateful day when the well-established scheme went awry.
This story begins on September 8, 2014, in Florida. The previous evening, spouses Nan Yao and Jill Su returned from a trip to Malaysia, where Nan Yao had been giving lectures. In the morning, the entomology professor shook off the fatigue from the flight and headed to work at the University of Florida. Jill allowed herself a bit more sleep, but got up around 9:30 when her 20-year-old son, Justin, also left home. He worked a part-time job as a professor's assistant. Shortly after noon, Justin's father called him. He wanted to confirm if the young man was at home. Justin replied that he was at work. His father called him because he noticed something unusual on the surveillance camera in the house. He asked his son to come back and check if everything was all right because the camera suddenly stopped transmitting images. 15 minutes later, Justin had already parked his car at home, entered through the garage, passed the sleeping dog in the corridor, and first checked a camera near the kitchen. However, the camera was missing, leaving only a dangling cable where it used to be connected. Justin knew that only his mother was in the house, and he couldn't fathom why someone would target her and rip the camera out with its wire. The situation was the same with the camera in the living room. As he walked into his room, Justin immediately noticed someone had been rifling through his belongings. Justin, an avid hunter and diver, collected knives, and some were now missing. He heard the sound of running water in the parents' bathroom and headed there. Upon entering the bathroom, he saw it filled with water and blood. His mother's lifeless body floated face down. Justin immediately thought of his father and called him. Nan Yao instructed his son to contact the rescue service, and Justin complied. He informed the dispatcher that his mother had done something to herself, the most rational explanation given what he saw at that moment. However, pulling his mother out of the water, he realized he had misunderstood everything. Her hands and legs were bound, and her body bore multiple wounds. Still on the line with the dispatcher, Justin declared that a murder had occurred. Rushing home, Nan Yao wanted to embrace and comfort his son, who had started having a fit of hysteria, but the officers did not allow him. Nan Yao was not aware of it, but it was the first sign that the police considered his son a suspect. The reason was that a folding knife belonging to Justin was lying near the front door. Another hunting knife, a gift from the mother to the son, became the murder weapon. The police found it at the bottom of the bathtub. There, the criminal also threw an emergency alarm panel. He took with him 2 surveillance cameras. It was also evident that the family's belongings had been rifled through. In the glass back door of the house, there was a hole the size of a doggy door. However, investigators were confident that it was not a burglary gone wrong, but a staged act, and a clumsy one at that, because the hole seemed too small for an adult to squeeze through, and the criminal took nothing besides the cameras. The police believe that the crime occurred in a fit of rage. Usually when a robber breaks into a house, they do not end up delivering more than 20 blows to the victim. Detectives delved into the lives of the victim's family. Nan Yao and Jill first met in Japan when she came as an exchange student, and he was working as a teacher. Afterward, Nan Yao went to the United States to pursue his doctoral degree, while Jill continued her travels in Southeast Asia. Approximately 2 years later, he received a postcard from her, deeply moved to learn that she was in Thailand, volunteering to aid Cambodian refugees. When she returned to America, the two married and adopted a daughter, Amanda. 3 years later, Justin joined the family. Jill not only remained a wonderful mother to her children, but also found the strength and time for volunteer work. She recorded audiobooks for people with visual impairments. There was no doubt that the Su family members loved each other deeply. However, tension arose in the last few months. Justin dropped out of college, which of course displeased his parents. Yet what intrigued the police even more was Jill Su's maiden name, Halliburton. Earl Halliburton had once been one of the wealthiest individuals in the country, amassing his fortune in the oil industry. When Earl passed away, his wealth was distributed among all family members, but the magnate had so many relatives that Jill, Amanda, and Justin received almost nothing. The Su family's bills were paid not by oil, but by termite control, thanks to Nan Yao's invention of an effective termite trap 30 years ago. Even after Jill's death, her share of the inheritance went to her husband, who considered himself quite affluent. All of Jill and Nan Yao's friends attested that the family lived in love and harmony. Just a few hours after Justin found his mother brutally murdered, he sat in the interrogation room at the police station. Several aspects of his story troubled the investigators. Firstly, how could he not immediately recognize it as murder, given the number of stab wounds inflicted on Jill? Moreover, the murder weapon, a knife, belonged to Justin. It seemed odd that the intruder didn't grab a readily available kitchen knife. Justin showed no signs of a struggle, answered all questions calmly, and did not request a lawyer. He explained to detectives that he left for work around 9:30 a.m., returned home at approximately 12:30 p.m. after his father's call, and initially didn't notice anything unusual. Initially, the officers were calm and delicate with Justin, but the tone of the interrogation quickly shifted to accusatory, especially after catching him in lies. He told his father he was at work on the phone but claimed to be at the college library when talking to the police. He later admitted to lying about that, stating he slept in his car in the parking lot. Justin explained he was worried about how his father would react to him sleeping in the car instead of studying or working, so he lied. Then Justin claimed he took another knife with him when he left the car and returned it later.
Clean, this is your only opportunity.
Oh my God.
You understand?
Your dad?
What? What did I say to my dad? I lied to my dad. I told him I was going to work.
Later, Justin claimed that as he was getting out of the car, he took another knife with him, but then he returned it to its place. So, after discovering Anne's mother, did he go and put the knife in the car? This, of course, was nonsense, and under pressure, Justin admitted that he had lied again. He didn't take any knife with him. However, Justin insisted from the beginning that the intruder broke into the house to steal something and didn't expect to encounter the homeowner. During breaks between interrogations, when investigators consulted with forensic experts about evidence in Nan Yao, Justin ran around the room, shouting, crying, and begging to be released.
Please let me out.
He was obviously in shock and couldn't calm down. In the adjacent room, Nan Yao heard his son's agony, but couldn't do anything because it was his turn to answer questions. After all, he was the one who raised the alarm that day. Nan Yao explained that around 12:15, he decided to check the surveillance cameras in the house. Unexpectedly, he saw an unfamiliar person, a fleeting figure in a mask that appeared for just a moment, heading towards the kitchen corner. As soon as the figure disappeared from view, the camera feed was lost. Nan Yao thought it could be his son. Justin sometimes deliberately blocked the cameras so his father couldn't see anything when friends visited, as he did 2 days ago when his parents were in Malaysia. But Justin told his father he was at work. Worried because Jill didn't answer calls, Nan Yao became anxious and asked his son to go home. Essentially, Nan Yao only saw the eyes of the intruder and described him as a tall and slender young man. Detectives couldn't help but notice that Justin fit this description. They seemed to be setting father and son against each other. They pointed out to Nan Yao that Justin matched his description. They told Justin that his father suspected him of murder. However, even when Justin was on edge and unsure of what to believe, Nan Yao never bought into it. Regardless of the tactics the investigators chose, they consistently pressured Justin for 11 grueling hours. But Justin maintained his innocence, requested a polygraph test, and insisted that they would come to apologize when the case was solved.
When you guys find out you're wrong, I hope you come and say sorry to me, man, or something.
If there was anything that could help the young man, it was the image of the intruder seen by his father. However, the hitch was that the Su family had agreed to a 2-week trial period during which recordings from their cameras would be saved, and this period ended exactly 2 days before the crime. As the couple was in Malaysia and likely forgot to renew this service, there were simply no recordings. In other words, Nan Yao saw the real-time image, and when the image disappeared, it was gone forever. However, other detectives reviewed the surveillance camera footage near the entrance of the gated community where the family lived. They confirmed that Justin left at 9:15 and didn't reappear until 3 hours later when he returned home at his father's request. In other words, the murder occurred while Justin was not at home. After hours of accusations and pressure at the police station, they simply opened the door and allowed him to go home. Waiting for him behind the door was his father, who did his best to comfort his son. Unlike the police, he never believed in his son's guilt for a moment. In any case, Justin provided the police with a new lead that opened up an entirely new direction for the investigation. 2 days before the parents returned from Malaysia, Justin organized a party. The company was not very large, about 25 people around the age of 20, but now the list of people to be interrogated significantly increased. They were all invited to the station, and DNA and fingerprints were taken. No one objected. By that time, everyone already knew what had happened to Justin's mother and were willing to help. They mentioned that they were aware of the cameras because Justin had warned them and asked them to behave properly. Almost all the guests were his old friends, but not everyone. Some suggested that the police should pay attention to a guy with a bad reputation who had previously been arrested by the police. When officers arrived at his place, he admitted that he was expecting them. He confirmed that he had been arrested before, but for controlled substances, not robbery. His DNA was already in the database, so he had no problem providing it again. The young man had an alibi, and there were no scratches or signs of struggle on his body. In general, the police spoke with 30 people, and besides this guy, no one had legal issues. It seemed like the investigation was at a standstill, but that was not the case. Throughout this time, forensic experts were comparing DNA found at the crime scene, and after 9 days of investigation, news came from the laboratory. They had a match, and incredibly, the suspect's name was in the database. The DNA belonged to 20-year-old Diante Rezeles. Detectives pondered whether there might be an innocent reason for Diante being in the house. Perhaps he knew Justin, who was a year younger. The detective called Justin and listed 3 names, 2 of which were made up to test him. He didn't recognize any of them, including Diante. Diante grew up and lived near the Su family home. However, unlike Justin, he was raised by a single mother earning a minimum wage. Diante was not a typical child. He excelled in school, surprisingly well-read, and teachers loved him. However, by adolescence, he became bored with mundane lessons and got involved with a bad crowd. By the age of 18, he had been arrested 8 times, mostly for robberies. His modus operandi sounded familiar to the detectives. He would rent expensive cars and disguise himself to explain his presence in affluent neighborhoods. Diante targeted luxurious mansions in gated communities near the water, infiltrating homes through openings in rear glass doors and disabling surveillance cameras when possible. However, he never attacked the homeowners. If he thought someone was at home, he would flee. In his neighborhood, Diante was liked and considered a Robin Hood figure. He generously shared his loot, paying for others' electricity bills and rent. He could spend $1,000 on diapers and food for single mothers. Perhaps this is why no one believed or wanted to believe he was capable of the accusations against him. On July 15, 2016, almost 2 years after Jill's murder, an unexpected turn of events occurred during what started as a routine court hearing. The prisoner accused of first-degree murder, restrained in handcuffs and shackles, managed to escape from the crowded courtroom. This prisoner was none other than Diante Rezeles. How did he pull off such an escape? When investigators listened to the recordings of the prisoner's phone calls, they realized the plan was orchestrated by teenagers. Everything was set up that morning. The key was to obtain the handcuff key. Diante had weakened the prison jumpsuit to make it easier to run, and he wore regular clothes underneath. When he was led into the courtroom in handcuffs and shackles, another inmate shielded him while removing the chain from his waist, allowing Diante's hands some movement. He entered the courtroom, surrounded by other prisoners awaiting their hearings. Undoing the handcuffs, he waited for his accomplices to be ready. His twin cousins, acting as Diante's eyes and ears, were also present in the courtroom. As soon as a car approached, one cousin signaled to the other, who then signaled to Diante. When new prisoners were brought into the courtroom, Diante simply stood up and ran. Once outside, he discarded the prison jumpsuit and, knowing the route, which his accomplices had undoubtedly described to him, he sprinted out of the building to a waiting car. Days passed, 2, 3, 4. The fugitive eluded officers, and the reward for his capture grew to $50,000. His family and friends refused to assist the police. On the contrary, they did not believe in his guilt and did what they could to protect him. People couldn't comprehend how a robber, who avoided confrontation with homeowners, had evolved into a killer, assaulting a woman with more than 20 knife wounds. Yet, someone decided to turn in Diante, revealing he was hiding in a motel. 6 days after the escape, Diante Rezeles was captured. He offered no resistance during the arrest. In the subsequent months, all 8 friends who aided Diante's escape were apprehended and charged. This demonstrated Diante's intelligence and extraordinary charisma, convincing these individuals to risk their freedom for him. After his arrest, Diante wrote a letter to the judge from whose trial he escaped, apologizing for the escape. He explained that he had to free himself to find evidence of his innocence. However, when he was apprehended, he was merely sitting in a hotel, interacting with friends, and visiting adult websites. The trial began in 2021, and as with everything in this story, it concluded with an incredible twist. The prosecution was convinced of the case because Diante could not explain the presence of his DNA on the 3 crucial elements of the crime: the belt used to tie the victim, one of Justin's knives, and the back door. The version of events seemed to suggest itself. Diante broke into the house with the intention of robbery. Suddenly, he encountered the homeowner and a struggle ensued. At some point, the woman tried to escape onto the street through the front door, according to a neighbor of the Su family. It was noon when she heard a scream from the neighbor's house. She managed to notice an object at the front door that sharply moved inside the house. She thought it was a dog. However, investigators and the prosecutor believed it was Jill screaming when Diante dragged her back into the house. After that, he must have struck her with Justin's knife, as the sharp protrusion on the murder weapon exactly matched the head injury on Jill. When the woman lost consciousness, the perpetrator took her to the bathtub, tied her up, and inflicted knife wounds. Despite detectives initially thinking the criminal wanted to create the appearance of a robbery, the evidence actually matched an interrupted burglary. Additionally, Diante's escape from the courtroom and his attempts to persuade friends to provide him with an alibi worked against him.
Diante bribed a prison guard to get a phone, thinking he had succeeded. However, all his calls were, of course, monitored by the police. The defendant asked his friend to lie for him, saying he was in Georgia, not Florida, on the day of the murder. Even though Diante's phone records proved he was in Florida, he tried to find an explanation for the main prosecution evidence and asked his friend to lie about the DNA. He suggested his friend pretend someone attacked Diante, cut him, and took his blood to leave at the crime scene. The guy reasoned that accusing a person who was no longer alive would prevent further questioning. However, he didn't know that forensic experts hadn't found his blood at the crime scene and obtained DNA from his other biological materials. It seemed like the evidence was indisputable, but the jury deliberated for 5 days and found Diante Rezilis guilty of involuntary manslaughter, not first-degree murder as he was charged. It was a blow to Jill's family, but that was the jury's decision. Or was it? The judge began asking each member of the jury one by one if they agreed with the verdict. It was a standard procedure in court. Therefore, the unexpected answer from the jury foreperson was surprising. She said no. Later, she explained her decision. When the jury deliberated, they couldn't ignore the evidence against Diante. But 3 people were against convicting the pleasant young man of first-degree murder. They argued and argued, eventually compromising on involuntary manslaughter. However, when the jury foreperson saw the reaction of the defense attorneys in the courtroom, clapping Diante on the back, smiling, giggling, and congratulating each other on the victory, she declared that she disagreed with the verdict. In her opinion, Diante deserved a more severe punishment. The trial ended in nothing. A few months later, there was a retrial with new jurors, and this time, the defendant was found guilty of first-degree murder. Involuntary manslaughter meant that Diante would spend a maximum of 15 years in prison. For first-degree murder, he faced the death penalty or life imprisonment. The Su family asked the prosecutors to waive the death penalty because that's what Jill wouldn't have wanted. Diante was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This case was unusual from the very beginning to the end. The police claim their task is to be the voice of the victim. However, it seems they didn't think through this statement. After all, Justin's mother would hardly want to accuse her son of her murder. The most horrifying part is that the police actions were used by Diante's lawyers. For them, Justin was the perfect alternative suspect. Allegedly, they had a fight with his mother, and the son killed her with his knife. Detectives pressured and harassed Justin, hoping to record a confession, but all they captured were vehement false accusations against the young man, which became a problem for the prosecution. But the most astonishing aspect of this case was how successfully Diante manipulated people. Overall, he coerced at least 16 individuals into illegal actions to help him escape and fabricate alibis, including 3 young women, each of whom considered herself his girlfriend. Many still do not believe in his innocence.
assuming that the police found a scapegoat, and Deontay would never exhibit such cruelty. Currently, the young man is in prison, hoping that his release will be attributed not to appeals or exemplary behavior, but to Kim Kardashian, who is known for her advocacy for prisoners' rights. This is an excellent indicator that Deontay might never regain his freedom. I will tell you a story. It won't be a happy family tale. It's a story about human psychology, control, and manipulation. And the worst part of this story is not the events unfolding in it. The worst part of this story is that it's true. The story begins in a fast food restaurant where Louise, an employee, is about to experience the worst day of her life. However, the day starts like any other. Employees serve customers, do their jobs, when suddenly a phone call interrupts the routine. A police officer informs about a theft that occurred in the restaurant. He claims that Louise stole a wallet from a customer and asks the assistant manager to inspect her personal belongings and confiscate her phone. After the search yields no results, the officer requests the manager to detain the girl until his arrival. And this is just the first of many increasingly questionable requests awaiting her ahead. In April 2004, Louise Ogborn from Mount Washington, Kentucky, celebrated her 18th birthday. As one of the top 10 students, she looked forward to enjoying her last month of school before pursuing a career in medicine. Louise was not only a talented artist and photographer, but also known for her reputation as a responsible and well-mannered young woman. When her mother lost her job due to health issues, Louise decided to temporarily set aside her dream and started contributing financially to her family. In January 2004, she took a part-time job at McDonald's. Earning $6.35 per hour, Louise was considered a reliable employee who never hesitated to take on extra shifts to help her colleagues. On Friday, April 9th at 4:45 p.m., as Louise was preparing to go home after her shift, she was asked to stay a bit longer to cover for a sick colleague. Without hesitation, she agreed, aiming to assist and earn some extra income. At 4:56, the work phone rang, and Donna Summers, a 51-year-old assistant manager for about 8 months, answered the call. The caller identified himself as Officer Scott. Officer Scott claimed that the restaurant's general manager, Lisa Siddons, was also on the line with him. He explained that he was calling because a girl who had recently been in the establishment had her wallet stolen and they suspected someone on Summers' staff. Scott provided a description of the suspect, a young, slender girl with dark hair wearing the restaurant uniform. Summers immediately thought of Louise. Despite Louise having an excellent work record, she fit the description perfectly. Leaving Officer Scott on the line, Summers asked Louise to accompany her to the manager's office. Donna led Louise into the office and locked the door. Donna informed Louise that a police officer accused her of stealing a wallet. Shocked, Louise immediately declared her innocence, stating that she could never steal anything. Donna explained that the police officer had described Louise as a suspect in the theft. Officer Scott was still on the line, and Summers alternated between talking to him and Louise. Scott informed Summers that the girl had a choice. She could consent to a search on the spot, or wait for the officer to arrive, arrest her, and conduct the search at the police station. Learning of these options, Louise began to cry and thought it would be better to go to the police station to resolve the matter there. However, Summers handed the phone to Louise, and after talking to Officer Scott, she agreed to a search right in the restaurant. Scott directed Summers, who relayed instructions to Louise. Initially, Louise was asked to empty her pockets, and she complied without objections. After handing over her keys and mobile phone, Louise showed that there was no stolen wallet in her pockets. However, Scott suspected that it might be hidden under her clothing and ordered her to remove it. It's worth noting that at this point, Kim Dockery, also acting as an assistant manager, arrived for the evening shift. Kim asked what was happening, but Summers refused to explain, following Officer Scott's demand. In the presence of Donna and Kim, Louise reluctantly removed her uniform and was left only in her underwear. She covered her face with her hands and cried while Donna examined her clothing. There was no stolen wallet in her clothes, but this was deemed insufficient. Louise was then ordered to remove the remaining clothes and hand them over to Donna for inspection. Louise complied. All of this became too much for Donna Summers, who started doubting the truthfulness of the accusations against Louise. In response, Scott made a shocking statement. The police were investigating Louise's involvement in more serious crimes, and officers were currently searching her family's home for illicit substances. Thus, Louise's clothing and other belongings were considered evidence in the investigation. Scott ordered Summers to put them in a bag and take them to her car so he could pick them up shortly. During this time, Kim tried to comfort Louise. She gave her an apron to cover herself. As the restaurant was crowded, Kim returned to her work. Summers told the police officer that she also needed to work. Then Officer Scott asked her to find a male employee who would watch over Louise until the police arrived. Summers called 27-year-old restaurant cook Jason Bradley. She left him in the office with Louise and the phone while she returned to her duties. The young man tried not to look at Louise, who was covered with a dirty apron, while listening to Officer Scott's instructions. Learning that Louise had nothing on except the apron, the police officer ordered Jason to take it from her and describe Louise to him. This demand upset Jason. After talking to Scott for just a few minutes, he stormed out of the office and told Donna Summers that he considered it discrimination. He declared to Donna that he wouldn't participate and was going back to the kitchen. Summers didn't understand what had offended Jason and picked up the phone again. She explained to the police officer that there was no one to watch over Louise. In response, Scott asked if she was married. Summers chuckled and admitted that she was engaged. When asked if she trusted her fiancé, Summers naturally answered yes. Scott then asked if her fiancé could come to the restaurant to keep an eye on the girl. Summers agreed to call him. Walter Nix Jr. was a 42-year-old father of two, working as an exterminator and coaching the local youth baseball team. He was generally considered a respected member of the community. He had recently become engaged to Donna Summers. Shortly before 6 p.m., Summers called her fiancé on her mobile phone. She explained that a restaurant employee was suspected of stealing a wallet, and she asked if he could watch over her until the police arrived. Nix agreed. When he arrived at McDonald's, Summers led him into the office and left him alone with Louise and the office phone. Louise stood against the wall, leaning back, crying. As soon as Donna left the office, Officer Scott wasted no time. He ordered Nix to take the apron from Louise and describe her to him. Unlike Jason, Nix complied with this demand. He did not refuse subsequent instructions. Nix forced Louise to stand on a chair to inspect her more thoroughly. Then he compelled her to jump to ensure she wasn't hiding anything of interest to Officer Scott. Occasionally, Nix handed Louise the phone to speak with the police officer. Scott quickly convinced the girl that if she wanted to keep her job, she should cooperate. Donna or Kim would periodically enter the office. Each time Nix heard them approaching, following Officer Scott's orders, he threw the apron to Louise and gestured for her to be quiet, placing a finger to his lips. When the clock showed 6:50 p.m., Louise had spent almost an hour with Nix. Officer Scott's demands were becoming increasingly alarming. When Louise failed to address Nix with a distinctly polite "sir" and continued asking questions, Nix was ordered to slap her. Despite Louise insisting that Scott's demands were absurd, Nix listened to the police officer, not her. A few minutes later, Summers returned to the office. As she approached to grab something, Louise put her head on her shoulder and quietly pleaded for her to take her away. "Donna, please take me out of here, Donna, please. Please believe me, I didn't do anything wrong," the girl said. She asked Summers to call the police, but Summers replied that they were already waiting for the police to arrive. Summers left again. Louise also wanted to escape, but couldn't. The only way out would be to run through the entire restaurant where there were many customers. Additionally, Louise was frightened by Nix's appearance, as he was much taller and weighed 104 kilograms. When Nix and Louise were alone again, Officer Scott resumed his instructions. He made Nix sit the girl on his lap and kiss her to examine her breath. Later, Louise would recount that at this moment, she became paralyzed and felt as if her consciousness had detached from her body. Shortly before 7:30 p.m., Scott demanded something unimaginable, that Louise remove Nix's pants and satisfy him. The girl cried and pleaded, saying, "No, I haven't done anything wrong. This is ridiculous." But Nix threatened her with physical punishment if she did not comply with the police's orders. Finally, Louise gave in. 10 minutes later, at 7:52 p.m., Donna entered the office to retrieve some gift certificates. Louise and Nix, as before, were in different corners of the office. Following Scott's orders, Nix handed the phone to Summers and left the restaurant, getting into his car. When he arrived home, he called a friend, telling him, "I did something incredibly horrible." At the same time, Donna was ordered to find someone to replace Nix in the manager's office. She chose 58-year-old employee Thomas Sims, who wasn't working that day and had just stopped by the restaurant for coffee and dessert. Summers asked the man to accompany her to the office, where Louise was inside. Baffled, Thomas took the phone, and Summers left him alone with the girl. Following the familiar pattern, Officer Scott ordered Thomas to take the apron from Louise and describe her to him. Thomas refused to comply and went out to find Summers. He told her about Scott's outrageous request and stated, "Something is not right here." Thomas demanded to return the girl's clothes and call the police. Summers, shocked, called the restaurant's general manager, Lisa Siddons, who was supposedly on the other line with Officer Scott the entire time. Siddons answered the call with an evidently tired voice, having no idea what Summers was talking about and explaining that she had been sleeping. Once Summers realized she had been deceived, the fake police officer abruptly ended the conversation. By this time, Louise had been in the office for almost 3 hours. Shivering from cold and shock, she asked if she needed to come to work tomorrow. Kim reassured the girl that she could take as much time off as needed. Louise was given back her clothes and allowed to get dressed, while Summers started apologizing. Panicking restaurant employees and managers gathered in the office. After discussing the situation among themselves, around 9 p.m., they decided to call the police. Since the police station was less than a kilometer away, real police officers arrived within just 5 minutes. Buddy Stump, a detective from the city police station, was among the colleagues who arrived at the establishment and couldn't believe his ears when he heard what had happened. The surveillance camera in the office captured everything that occurred with Louise. The video infuriated the detective, and he suspected that someone had made the call using a prepaid phone card from within the McDonald's to observe how the prank unfolded. The next day, the local police chief decided to search for information about similar pranks on the internet. To the surprise of both Chief and Detective Stump, the search yielded hundreds of matches. Similar calls were documented in various states. In each case, the caller pretended to be a police officer or a manager, then asked the store or restaurant manager to assist in an investigation. The requests always involved a thorough search of young women. The prankster targeted fast food chain restaurants in small towns and had been active for 12 years. Interestingly, this wasn't the first incident in Kentucky. In 2000, a McDonald's manager responded to a call from someone claiming to be a police officer. The caller suspected a customer of a crime and convinced the manager to remove her clothes to act as bait for the alleged perpetrator. He guaranteed that undercover officers were monitoring the situation and would come to her rescue before the suspect could harm her. In another incident at a Burger King in Indiana, the fake officer persuaded the manager to search a young female employee. When the girl's father arrived, as usual, to take her home, he had to literally jump over the counter and forcibly make the manager release his daughter. By the end of 2003, there were almost 60 similar incidents reported. Upon learning the extent of the prankster's crimes, Detective Buddy Stamp set a goal to find and apprehend him once and for all. Fortunately, someone in the McDonald's restaurant managed to dial *69 when Officer Scott finished the call. This function allowed them to trace the call. Detective Stamp determined that a prepaid AT&T phone card was used for the call, sold at a Walmart in Panama City, Florida, on April 9th at 3:02 p.m., less than 2 hours before the incident with Louise began. Stamp's colleagues in Panama City connected him with Detective Victor Flaherty, an investigator from Massachusetts, who was probing similar calls to Boston restaurants. Flaherty also linked the Boston calls to prepaid AT&T cards sold in Panama City supermarkets. By comparing surveillance camera images of card buyers at Walmart, the police discovered that the person of interest was a man in the uniform of a local prison supervisor. They quickly identified the suspect as 38-year-old David Stewart. Stewart was married and raising 5 children, having worked in the prison for 11 months. Previously, he had worked as a security guard in a shopping center and as a truck driver. Flaherty went to Stewart's home, introduced himself, and asked if he had a prepaid phone card. The man sweated profusely and inquired if anyone was harmed. When told that no one was physically harmed, but the psychological recovery would take years, he exclaimed, "Finally, it's all over." Despite his exclamation, Stewart denied any knowledge of the calls or having a phone card. He called a lawyer and invoked his right to remain silent. Police searched Stewart's trailer home, finding numerous police journals and dozens of rejected police job applications. Only one phone card was found in the trailer, and it turned out to be not the one used for the call to McDonald's in Kentucky, Mount Washington, although it was used for 9 other calls in 2003. Law enforcement in Mount Washington charged Stewart, and he was transferred to Kentucky. In case of a guilty verdict, he faced a 15-year prison sentence. Around the same time, Louise agreed to give an interview and share what happened during that incident. She explained how she trusted Donna Sammers, believing that as an assistant manager, she would take care of her employees. Louise confessed that her greatest desire at that moment was to escape from the office, but in her perception, fleeing from the office would be equivalent to fleeing from the police. Additionally, her family depended financially on her job and she feared losing it. She also noted that her parents had taught her to obey and not argue when an adult asked her for something. Louise's interview was supplemented with comments from a clinical psychologist who confirmed that her description of feeling as if her consciousness had separated from her body was common among people who had experienced similar situations. As a result of the prank call, Walter Nix faced serious charges. Donna was shown what her fiancé had done to Louise, and she immediately ended her relationship with him. Initially, Summers was suspended from work at the restaurant and later dismissed. McDonald's cited a violation of company rules, specifically that the woman brought a stranger into the office, as the reason for her dismissal. Summers was also charged with unlawful imprisonment. Her colleague, Kim Dockery, was transferred to another restaurant. Collectively, the charges against Nix could have led to a 20-year prison sentence. In February 2006, he pleaded guilty to assault and unlawful imprisonment in exchange for a 5-year prison term. He claimed that he himself became a victim because he sincerely believed in following the police officer's orders, even when the orders became inhumane. During the trial, he apologized to Louise. Summers was sentenced to a year of probation, although the prosecutor insisted on actual imprisonment. He explained, "It didn't matter whether Summers thought she was dealing with a police officer or not. If the President of the United States ordered to take a girl's clothes and lock her in a room, there would be no justification for that." However, some leniency was shown towards her after Louise revealed that her manager had been deceived and she became another victim of the crime. The trial of Stewart began on October 24, 2006, following the court decisions in the cases of Nix and Summers so they could testify against him. Nix claimed in court that he simply followed Officer Scott's instructions. Donna asserted that she spoke with 3, as it seemed to her, different people and heard a police raid in the background. Moreover, Scott knew the names of several employees and a customer in the restaurant, claiming that the general manager of the establishment, Lisa, was on the other line, so Donna believed she was talking to a real police officer. Detective Stamp questioned how Stewart could know the names of the employees and customers. He replied that he did not know because investigators could never confirm these claims. The bombshell effect was produced by the testimony of Thomas Sims, a restaurant worker who put an end to the cruel prank. According to him, Louise said she would receive a substantial check as a result of what she went through. Thomas admitted that he never reported this statement to the police and only informed McDonald's management. Stewart's lawyers skillfully used this testimony to suggest that Louise staged the entire incident to demand compensation from McDonald's. The defense also argued that the prosecution lacked sufficient evidence, and the discovered phone card was not the one used to make the call to McDonald's in Kentucky, Mount Washington. Furthermore, the fact that Stewart bought the card does not prove that he used it. On October 31st, the jury found Stewart not guilty and all charges were dropped. Despite this, the prosecutors were convinced that they caught the right person, as there were no calls from the prankster since his arrest. Louise filed a $200 million civil lawsuit against McDonald's, blaming the company for not informing employees about the prankster, even though the company knew about the prankster for at least 2 years. There were about 30 other calls to McDonald's, and 12 cases resulted in lawsuits in 4 different states. All these cases ended in out-of-court settlements. Louise's case was the only one that went to trial. The jury was given 12 possible verdict options. They deliberated for a long time and finally decided that part of the blame for what happened lay with the prankster and the other part was on McDonald's. They ruled that the company would pay Louise over $6 million. It later became known that the jury members took a long time to deliberate because they couldn't agree on the compensation amount for Louise. One juror wanted to give her $100 million, while another insisted on just $1. As a result of an unsuccessful appeal, McDonald's was obliged to pay an additional $2.4 million to cover legal expenses. Incredibly, Donna also filed a $50 million lawsuit against McDonald's, claiming that the management did not warn restaurant managers about the prankster. In response, McDonald's stated that they initially did not inform managers because they did not want them to refuse to cooperate with real police officers. However, a few days before the incident in Kentucky, They did send a voice message to managers with a warning. They also argued that the strip search went against their rules since 2001, something Summers should have known. The company's representatives blamed Summers and Nix for the incident, as well as Louise herself, noting that all three should have understood that the call was a prank. Nevertheless, the jury decided to award Donna over $1.1 million, although the amount was later reduced to $500,000. Louise never returned to work at McDonald's. The incident left an indelible mark on her, and she had to take a long time to recover from the cruel prank. She was too traumatized to attend college as she had planned. Nevertheless, she gradually began to recover. She found a job at a law firm, met a nice young man, and soon became a mother. After receiving compensation, she admitted that she would use the funds to study law since her initial plans to become a medical professional were shattered. You never know how you'll act until you find yourself in a specific situation. One might wonder what's wrong with Donna or Nix, but more than 60 people acted exactly like Donna Summers. Why do we so easily obey orders, even when we know they are wrong? Why are we willing to inflict pain on others if someone else takes responsibility for it? There are a couple of well-known experiments that explain how the prankster managed to turn people into his puppets. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted what is now known as the Milgram experiment on obedience in psychology. The professor told participants that he was studying the learning process, but in reality, he was studying people's willingness to obey authority figures. Participants were asked to administer electric shocks with increasing voltage to people who incorrectly answered questions. In reality, these people were actors who did not suffer from electric shocks. However, the experiment showed that over 65% of participants would administer the maximum voltage to an innocent learner just because a person in a white lab coat told them to. In 1971, Professor Philip Zimbardo conducted a similar experiment known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. He divided student volunteers into two groups, with some becoming prisoners and others guards. The professor studied the psychological effect of obtained power. The experiment had to be terminated after just 6 days because the students quickly immersed themselves in their roles, and the guards began to show aggression towards the prisoners. Professor Zimbardo later hired a consultant from one of the fast food restaurant chains who became a victim of the prankster. He concluded that the criminal had read Milgram's work because he applied basic techniques of gaining control over people. The caller presented himself as a person with authority. He insisted on being treated with pronounced respect, using such terms as "sir." The caller told people that he took full responsibility and all consequences of what was happening. In case of resistance, he told people that they had to continue because they had no other choice. A woman walking or running alone on a trail. This image is often associated with a dense forest, where a thin, winding path leads deeper into it, and rays of light barely penetrate through the thick tree canopy. It's a place where an unsuspecting victim could be dragged off the trail, and nobody would hear her scream. But what if it's a sun-drenched, highly popular pathway located right in the heart of the city, where people stroll almost at any time? The attack on Katie Lorek happened precisely in such a wonderfully safe place. And that's the scariest part, because it confirms that a nightmare can become a reality in an instant. And something like this could happen to any one of us. Kathleen Louise Ayello Lorek, known as Katie, was born in New Mexico but grew up in California, where she met her future husband, Jeffrey Lyon. The young couple got married and they had 3 children, but despite 20 years together, the family eventually fell apart. Their divorce was a challenging process and was officially finalized in 1997. However, it turned out to be beneficial for the 44-year-old woman. Her friend recalls that Katie had always been a lively person, but after the divorce, she simply blossomed. Over the next 3 years, Katie advanced in her career, working as an assistant in Sistren Donner in Concord, California. It was a very successful and prominent company, and Katie held a high position in the office. A new, wonderful chapter began in her life. Her children were almost grown, she loved her job, and she started dating again. Despite being over 40, due to her excellent physical condition, grooming, and joyful attitude toward life, she attracted a lot of attention. At work, Katie introduced her son to one of her colleagues. The man's name was Johannes Lorek. There was an instant spark between them, and with Johannes, Katie felt she could be herself. They started dating, although their meetings were not very frequent because Johannes lived in Austria. However, they traveled together, had romantic weekends, and enjoyed skiing. In 2003, During a trip to a lake in Switzerland where they had gone for a skiing excursion, Johannes knelt down and asked Katie to marry him. She would have been happy to spend the rest of her life with Johannes, and just a few weeks later he came to the United States and they got married. The couple planned to live in Austria. After all, there was nothing truly tying the woman to the States. Her sons and daughter had grown up and supported her new relationship. Everyone who knew Katie wanted her to be happy, and it seemed like everything was heading that way in her marriage to Johannes. Meanwhile, Katie worked her last few weeks at the company, where her colleagues had practically become her family members. She was always ready to help her colleagues, genuinely concerned about each one of them, and was highly appreciated for it. However, no matter how open and caring Katie was, even she needed a breather. Her respite became the daily walks along a trail that started behind the parking lot of her office. During every lunch break, she would put on comfortable sport shoes and stroll along a trail slightly over 20 kilometers long. The Contra Costa Canal Trail passes through several residential neighborhoods, offices, and is surrounded by moderately dense but perfectly suitable greenery for walks. Besides enjoying the fresh air, Katie valued this time because she could make personal calls, especially to her husband. In Austria, it was around 9 o'clock in the evening, making it comfortable for the spouses to communicate. So, on Tuesday, May 13, 2003, colleagues saw Katie as usual at 12:40 p.m. She kicked off her office shoes, put on her sneakers, and left the office, just as she did every weekday. One might think that taking a solitary walk along a trail amidst shrubbery could be risky for an attractive woman, and in case of any danger, nobody would hear her scream. But this specific trail was nothing like that. Not only did it pass by residential homes and businesses, but people were constantly walking, jogging, walking dogs, and biking along it. It was nearly impossible to find a time during midday when the trail was deserted, yet someone managed to do so. Katie was deeply engaged in a conversation with her husband when he heard her either muffle a scream or sharply inhale before the phone disconnected. Johannes tried calling his wife back, assuming she might have simply stumbled and dropped her phone, but all calls went to voicemail. He knew Katie would call back, understanding that her abrupt end to the conversation might worry him, so he called her office to alert her colleagues. By that time, they were already concerned. Katie was punctual to the minute, and when she didn't return after lunch, they began searching for her. Johannes's call further troubled them. They knew what needed to be done. It was around 3 p.m. when the police were notified of Katie Lorek's disappearance. Credit must be given to the police. They didn't take the disappearance of an adult woman lightly and responded promptly. Just a few minutes after the call to the police, they dispatched officers to the trail since colleagues mentioned she should be there. The officers searched for her on foot, on motorcycles, and called in K9 units. The dog indeed led the K9 unit in the same direction the missing woman used to enjoy walking, so the officers knew they were on the right track. But how could she simply vanish in broad daylight? The search quickly led the K9 unit to a bloody trail on the pathway. It wasn't just a few drops, it was a very distinct trail, as if an injured person had been dragged from the trail into the bushes, but that wasn't all they found. A sneaker caught their eye, lying nearby in a pool of blood. Then they saw the body of a woman lying in the mud. She was in a small depression, covered in blood, her hair matted with it. She was naked, with a bra featuring an animal print lying on the grass nearby, along with black leggings, another sneaker, and a jacket. It seemed as though someone had forcibly removed items of clothing from the victim in a hurried manner. It was evident to the officers that the attack had turned violent, a brutal assault on an unprotected woman. Police immediately checked for signs of life in Katie, and despite all the injuries, it turned out she was still alive. The arriving paramedics swiftly transported her to the nearest hospital within minutes. Her condition was extremely fragile, and they were determined to help her. But at 4:54 p.m., they were compelled to pronounce Katie Lorek deceased. Once Katie was taken to the hospital, the forensic specialists aimed to preserve as much evidence as possible, but it was already too late. When it was discovered that Katie was still alive, the medical team worked urgently to save her life, and therefore, they couldn't act cautiously to preserve evidence. They cannot be blamed. It's essential to prioritize saving the life of the victim in such cases. Consequently, some evidence was compromised. However, the police almost immediately discovered something crucial: the weapon used in the crime. It turned out to be a part of a fence post. It was taken from the section of the barrier that had long been rusted. They surmised that whoever the perpetrator was, they had broken off a part of the post just before the attack. Perhaps the crime was impulsive rather than planned. Therefore, nobody paid attention to the strange object in the assailant's hands as it seemed harmless. While Katie was on the phone with her husband, she didn't see someone approaching or running up behind her. The attacker repeatedly struck her on the head. At least one blow must have caused her to weaken or lose consciousness, preventing her from screaming, and the assailant had the opportunity to drag her into the bushes without resistance. The murder weapon was covered in blood and was found next to the pool of blood where Katie was discovered. The forensic expert concluded that Katie died from head injuries. However, before that, the killer spent quite some time with her, committing various acts of violence. He left his semen on her body and skin particles on the murder weapon, which allowed the experts to retrieve his DNA. The DNA was cross-checked with the database, but there were no matches. After spending 2 hours at the crime scene, officers realized something was missing. Katie was on the phone during the attack. So where was her phone? It turned out the phone was on, and a ping led the police to an apartment building where 23-year-old Juan Sanchez lived. However, if investigators thought they would quickly arrest the suspect and close the case, it wasn't so simple. The young man explained that he was biking on the trail when he stumbled upon the phone without its owner nearby, so he assumed it was okay to take it. Juan showed the police where he found the gadget, and it was right near the crime scene. His words were trustworthy but not entirely convincing. He was asked to provide a DNA sample, and he readily agreed. Preemptively, it soon became clear that Juan was telling the truth. His DNA did not match the sample. He had merely found the victim's phone and was not the killer. However, since DNA comparison was going to take some time, the police delved into Katie's life. In such a fierce attack, the perpetrator is usually someone known to the victim, especially if the victim is a woman. First and foremost, detectives focused on Katie's ex-husband. What if the woman's second marriage had triggered jealousy and rage in him? However, despite the difficult divorce, there were no signs of animosity between the former spouses. Furthermore, Jeffrey had an alibi which ruled him out as a suspect. Before marrying Johannes, Katie was dating another man who lived in Germany, but on the day of the murder, he happened to be in the city due to interesting circumstances. Moreover, Katie had met him just 2 days before her death. Yet again, they couldn't link the man to the crime scene or establish a motive. What if the new man in the woman's life was responsible for her death? It wouldn't be the first time a man didn't want to be tied down by the bonds of marriage, but wasn't content with a divorce either. Usually money becomes a factor, such as insurance. Certainly, Johannes was thousands of kilometers away from his wife and spoke to her on the phone. On the other hand, he knew her schedule better than anyone, knew where she would be and at what time. Could he have hired a hitman? However, the murder weapon indicated that it was a spontaneous, not a planned crime. Besides, a hitman would likely have tried to flee the crime scene as quickly as possible rather than tormenting the woman. Everything suggested that the victim and the killer hadn't been acquainted before the incident. Therefore, detectives doubled their efforts to find witnesses who might have noticed something unusual on the trail that day. People recalled walking there themselves or with their pets, going to work, riding bikes. One cyclist remembered a stranger asking him for a cigarette. Overall, it seemed like an ordinary day, not hinting at anything out of the ordinary. Despite the shock that something like this had happened on the trail where they felt safe every day, a few witnesses remembered a man acting strangely. He was pointing at the canal, showing fish, as if trying to attract the attention of passers-by. 2 unrelated individuals asked to collaborate with an artist and ended up producing 2 remarkably realistic and similar composite sketches of this man. The only difference was the sunglasses that the man had on his head. The composite sketches were publicized in the media, and the public was asked for assistance. This prompted hundreds of calls from people eager to help. Furthermore, a reward was offered for assistance in apprehending the killer, $10,000 promised by the police, along with an additional $25,000 offered by Katie's company. The police compared the composite sketches with photos of local men who had been arrested for displaying aggression. The more they looked, the more they believed they had found a suspect, a man who lived in the area and was known to frequent the trail. He had been arrested for minor offenses and for assaulting a judge. His name was John Kaler, a 32-year-old. John was a mechanic who suffered from several mental health issues. He had several offenses on his record, mostly related to driving under the influence and an impulsive attack on a judge right inside the courthouse. At that time, he was in handcuffs and was immediately pulled away from the judge, but the attack was documented. There were no other aggressive actions, especially towards women, registered against him. However, he was remarkably similar to the composite sketches. Additionally, the search efforts lost track specifically on the street where John lived. The police were convinced that this wasn't just a coincidence and that they had apprehended the killer. They even called Katie's relatives and informed them that they had found the prime suspect. Now, they needed to detain him as carefully as possible. The police arrived at John's father's house where he resided. His sister answered their knock. She confirmed they were at the right address, but John was no longer available to talk. John had died. On May 14th, the day after the investigation began, John went to the Golden Gate Bridge and jumped. The police were allowed to search the house. They found another piece of evidence supporting their theory, a pair of sunglasses identical to those in the composite sketch. They discovered clothing with something resembling bloodstains on it, and in John's room there was a newspaper article about Katie's murder, along with the composite sketches of the suspect. What was the police supposed to think? Could this be a coincidence? It seemed like John had committed the crime, realized the police would be onto him soon, and decided to end everything by going to the bridge. The police were confident that they closed the case within 72 hours. The man's body was in the morgue. All they needed was to take his DNA and compare it to the sample found on Katie Lorek. Witnesses identified John Keller from a photograph as the man on the trail that day. The DNA check became merely a formality. Confident in their righteousness, the officers declared to the media that the case was solved and proclaimed that the cruel murderer and rapist, John Keller, had been identified. Journalists descended upon the man's relatives, demanding answers to their questions and not allowing them to mourn their son and brother peacefully. In response, they criticized the detectives for not waiting for the DNA comparison results. John Keller's sister and father were convinced that the police were mistaken. His father stated that it was irresponsible to connect several random facts and fit them into a picture of the murder. They destroyed the reputation of a young man that was already tarnished. "It's unthinkable," he said. The family was distraught. John could no longer defend himself, and they tried to do it for him. John's father underwent a polygraph test to prove that his son was at home at the time of the crime. The polygraph showed that he was telling the truth. A month passed, Katie was buried, and the police were no longer actively investigating, simply waiting for the DNA test results. And finally, that day arrived. The samples didn't match. John hadn't assaulted or killed Katie. It was a massive blow to the investigators. Not only did they lose a month of investigation, but they also intensified the pain of John's family, who had lost a son and brother. Moreover, even after receiving the DNA test results, they didn't inform the public and only acknowledged the truth after John's father's statements. They stubbornly continued to claim that he might be somehow connected to the case. That's when the Keller family offered their own reward of $5,000 to anyone with information about Katie's murder, because they wanted to clear their son's name once and for all. Police took DNA samples from at least 50 men, acquaintances of Katie or resembling the composite sketch, but no matches were found. Then, after 4 months, a breakthrough occurred in the case. Early in the investigation, when questioning witnesses, one man mentioned that during the time frame the police were interested in, he was biking on the trail and stopped to smoke. A stranger approached and asked for a cigarette. The stranger smoked 2 cigarettes and the cyclist smoked 1. They chatted briefly, and that was the end of it. This happened about 60 meters from where Katie was found. The police decided to follow up on this lead, although it had been a week since the crime. They found a spot with 3 cigarette butts on the ground. Fortunately, they hadn't been rained on, and after 4 months, the DNA comparison result came back. The stranger who asked the witness for a cigarette was the rapist and murderer. But now the challenge was how to find him. The only hope lay in the memory of the cyclist. Miraculously, after 4 months, he recalled that the man worked in the telephone marketing field in a neighboring town. There was only one such company in that town, so armed with composite sketches, because that's all they had, the police went there. Employees immediately recognized 38-year-old Robert Ward Fraser in the images. However, he hadn't shown up for work since May, almost immediately after Katie's body was discovered. They couldn't locate him at his address. His former girlfriend confirmed that he had left a long time ago and presumed he might have returned to his hometown, but she wasn't certain. However, she found something useful for the police. Robert's toothbrush. Again, a DNA test would take time, and it wouldn't hurt to investigate the suspect for the time being. The man had a history of legal issues, having been arrested 9 times, particularly for robberies and related to illegal substances. He was known for his aggressive behavior in prison. He closely matched the witnesses' descriptions, and an arrest warrant had been issued in Indiana for violating parole conditions. Contacting the Indiana police, the Concord, California officers couldn't believe their luck when they were informed that Robert had tried to return to his hometown and was naturally arrested. Detectives flew from California to Indiana to talk to him. During the interrogation, the man was relaxed, slouched in his chair, joked, and didn't resemble someone afraid of anything. He confirmed that he lived in California, was near the crime scene, and smoked cigarettes with a cyclist around the time of the murder. Robert admitted he heard about Katie Lorek's case on TV, but when the police clarified if he remembered what the woman looked like, he answered that she had long hair, seemed to be a brunette, and guessed that she had freckles. Caught, thought the officers, he provided information that only the killer could have known. Katie did indeed have freckles, but they were not visible in any of the photos shown in the news. The freckles were not on her face, especially since she used makeup, not on her hands, but on the woman's chest. More precisely, between her breasts, meaning only someone who had seen her naked could know about it. And he couldn't have just guessed that. Detectives informed Robert that they had the perpetrator's DNA, to which he started talking about relieving himself in the bushes. In other words, he chose the same spot as the rapist. However, semen was found on Katie, which was an entirely different story. Robert's defense began to crumble, and the detective tried to press him, showing him the bloodiest photo of the victim and asking what she had done to deserve such a thing. Robert claimed he didn't want to see it and that he was not guilty. He sounded quite convincing. The suspect refused to communicate further without a lawyer, but his confession wasn't necessary. His DNA was taken, and it matched the DNA on Katie and on the murder weapon. Witnesses identified Robert as the person they saw on the trail. He was charged with violence, sodomy, and first-degree murder. He faced the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial took place in May 2006. The prosecutor systematically walked the jury through the events of that day. Robert came to the trail with intentions to satisfy his most base desires. He chose Katie because at that moment there were no witnesses on the trail. He grabbed the first weapon he found and attacked the woman, who was talking to her husband on the phone and was unaware of the danger. The prosecutor stated that what we don't know and will never know is how Katie experienced her last moments of life. She is not here with us to tell whether she begged, cried, pleaded for her life, or if she was even conscious after the first blow while the assailant continued to torment her. He then killed the woman, all for a few moments of pleasure. The defense attorneys tried to save the defendant's life, telling the story of his childhood suffering from both physical and psychological violence. However, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. He awaits the execution of the sentence at San Quentin. In 1994, in the small town of New Haven in the state of New York, 18-year-old Heidi Allen was abducted from the store where she worked. 2 brothers were accused of her kidnapping, but 2 separate trials led to paradoxical outcomes. All charges were dropped against one brother, while the other was found guilty. However, if you thought, well, at least they caught the guy who did it, by the end of this story, you'll likely change your opinion. On April 3, 1994, Easter Sunday, 18-year-old Heidi Allen began her shift at the convenience store attached to the D&W gas station in New Haven, a town in Oswego County, New York. Heidi was a determined and energetic young woman with ambitions of building a career in education or psychological counseling. Devoting much of her time to sports, her tall and robust build made her an invaluable member of volleyball and other teams. Despite her athletic prowess, she maintained a friendly demeanor, and everyone noted her warmth and responsiveness. Heidi had been working at D&W for over 2 years. It was her day off, but she agreed to cover a shift so that her colleague could spend the day with her children. Heidi's shift began at 5:45, and she arrived at work with her boyfriend. This was not unusual, as he often accompanied her to ensure she felt safe while opening the store very early in the morning. Typically, he would wait until the first customers arrived and then go about his day. That's exactly how it played out on April 3rd. Another customer entered the store but didn't see any staff. It might have seemed like the store was closed, but the gas pumps were operational and the lights were on inside. The customer went outside and flagged down a passing patrol car. Sheriff's deputies entered the store, finding everything seemingly in order. There was money in the cash register, and $9.50 was on the counter, left by another customer as payment for fuel and a newspaper. There were no signs of struggle or apparent issues. A security alarm was located under the counter, but it hadn't triggered that day. The officers discovered Heidi's car parked on the street, and her purse and car keys were still in the store. Despite the absence of signs of a struggle, the sheriff's deputies concluded that she might have been abducted, and the search for her began immediately. The state police offered assistance to the sheriff's office in Oswego County with the search for the missing girl. They had the resources to block all exits and ensure the abductor wouldn't escape. However, the sheriff inexplicably declined the offer, stating that his team could handle it on their own. Officers checked the punched receipts at the store's cash register and discovered that the last purchase was made at 7:42 when someone bought 2 packs of cigarettes. It was crucial to find this customer, as they were the last person to see the girl at work. Fortunately, the search for this individual didn't take much time. As soon as the news of Heidi's presumed abduction spread through the town, a man named Richard Thibodeau called the police. He claimed to be the one who was in the store that morning. The girl sold him cigarettes, and he left afterward. When extensive searches for the girl began, local residents, including Richard Thibodeau, his brother Gary, and his wife Teresa, joined in. Around the same time, Christopher Bivens contacted the police, describing how he drove past the store and saw 2 men leading a tall young woman toward a van. He thought one of the men was holding the woman tightly. He admitted he didn't remember the appearance of the van or the men, but noted that they were quite tall. Despite Richard Thibodeau voluntarily contacting the police and assisting in the search for the girl, law enforcement grew suspicious of him due to the timing of his purchase, just minutes before the concerned customer approached the sheriff's deputies. Additionally, he drove a van similar to the one described by Christopher. The police searched Richard's van, but nothing connecting the vehicle or its owner to Heidi was found. Richard willingly provided his fingerprints, blood samples, and hair without objection. Due to suspicions surrounding Richard, investigators turned a closer eye to his brother, Gary Thibodeau. After all, Christopher Bivens saw 2 men taking the young woman out of the store. Gary explained to detectives that he was still sleeping at home that early morning, and his girlfriend confirmed his alibi. A month later, the police charged Richard Thibodeau with the abduction. Gary was also taken into custody, albeit for a different minor offense unrelated to Heidi's disappearance. While he was in jail, law enforcement managed to build a case against the brothers. Suddenly, 2 inmates emerged, claiming that Gary had said Heidi was no more and she would never be found. Thus, detectives arrested a man who had voluntarily called the police and reported being in the store that morning. Despite no evidence against him, Richard willingly provided all the necessary samples and underwent a polygraph test. However, it seemed to have little significance. Richard and his brother Gary, a person with an alibi, were charged with first-degree kidnapping. A jury trial was conducted separately for Gary Thibodeau. During the trial, no concrete evidence or forensic testimony was presented, and Heidi was still missing. However, the prosecution was confident in their case. They called a witness who had seen 2 men with a girl near the store that morning, and jury members heard the statements of 2 inmates regarding Gary's alleged remarks about Heidi. Although the information provided by the 2 convicted individuals contradicted not only each other, but also established facts at that time, they were allowed to testify in court. The jurors heard that Heidi disappeared within just 13 minutes between the last recorded cigarette sale and the arrival of sheriff's deputies at the store. During these 13 minutes, the witness saw 2 men leading the young woman to a car. He described the vehicle as a white van with 2 dark blue or black doors at the back and 2 doors of the same color on the right side, along with a wide 6-inch black stripe above the wheels. The same witness, Christopher Bivens, identified the van as the one driven by Richard. However, it's crucial to note the interesting evolution in the testimony of this key prosecution witness. Initially, he could hardly recall anything about the men or the van where Heidi was supposedly placed. Suddenly, he could remember minute details, and the height of the men decreased to match the Thibodeau brothers' heights. Another customer from the store was called to testify. He made a purchase at 7:41, just a minute before Richard bought 2 packs of cigarettes. The man explained that there was a running van in the parking lot, and he assumed it was Richard's. He saw Richard in the store and, for some reason, believed there were 2 men in the van. Essentially, his testimony merely confirmed that Richard Thibodeau was in the store, a fact that Richard did not deny. A 13-year-old girl also provided testimony, claiming to have seen Richard's van parked at Gary's house shortly after Heidi Allen's disappearance. The girl insisted she remembered this because it was Easter Sunday. She had just woken up and looked out the window to see the van. However, after the trial, she recanted her statements, admitting that it could have been a dream. This constituted the evidence presented by the sheriff's deputies. The prosecutors had no concrete evidence linking the Thibodeau brothers to the abduction, no motive for the crime, and no logical explanation for why Richard Thibodeau would buy cigarettes if he intended to abduct the girl. Why not simply pocket the cigarettes when he and his brother allegedly took Heidi out of the store? Despite all this, Gary Thibodeau was found guilty of first-degree kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole. During Richard's trial, nearly all the same evidence was presented, except for the testimony of the two inmates. However, since a different judge presided over the case, and there were different jurors, the outcome of the trial turned out to be entirely different. All charges against Richard were dropped. Richard returned to his family, while Gary began serving his sentence in prison. Gradually, the case of Heidi Allen's abduction began to fade from memory until an unexpected turn occurred in February 2013. A woman named Tanya Priest called the police, claiming she needed to unburden her conscience. She recounted a conversation that took place in 2006 when she gave a ride to her friend Victoria West to the trailer home where she lived with her boyfriend James Steen. The couple invited her inside, and as they chatted about random topics, a news segment about Heidi aired on TV. The girls started discussing what might have happened to her when James suddenly said, "Do you really want to know?" and began his story. It was the last thing the girls expected to hear. Steen revealed that he, along with two friends, Roger Breckenridge and Michael Borer, had abducted Heidi that day, taking her out of the store and putting her into Michael Borer's van. Borer was waiting in the van, meaning that two men took the girl out of the store, just as witness Christopher Bivens had claimed. The men then drove Heidi to the trailer home of Breckenridge's girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott, on Rice Road in the town of Mexico, Oswego County. Steen added that they had long gotten rid of that van, but the body could still be found in a shed in the woods across from where the trailer had been located. When asked why they had committed such a grave act, Steen explained that Heidi was planning to report to the police their involvement in illegal drug trafficking. At first, the friends didn't believe Steen, thinking he wouldn't harm a fly. However, a few years later, when Steen killed his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend, who happened to be his cousin, out of jealousy, Tanya Priest was no longer sure that Steen was so harmless. Interestingly, the police initially hesitated to believe Tanya Priest's words, but she was determined not to give up, and the officers eventually yielded to her persistent requests to investigate this version. They assisted Tanya in secretly recording a phone conversation with Roger Breckenridge's ex-girlfriend, Jennifer Westcott. In the phone conversation, Westcott admitted knowing about what happened to Heidi Allen and went so far as to say that the men didn't bring the abducted girl into her trailer, but left her in the van. However, when sheriff's deputies questioned Jennifer and presented her with the recording, she evaded and claimed she just wanted to quickly end the conversation with Tanya, agreeing with everything she said. During a polygraph test, she lied about knowing who abducted Heidi Allen. Despite this information, law enforcement did not actively pursue the case. At this point, Tanya reached out to Gary Thibodeau's lawyer because by then, she was convinced of his innocence and wanted to help him secure his release. It's worth noting that the main problem in this case has always been the motive behind the crime. It's entirely unclear why the Thibodeau brothers would kidnap a girl they barely knew. Similarly, the motive for three men to take such a heavy burden upon themselves remains unclear. However, it turns out that such a motive could exist, and law enforcement authorities did not want the truth to come to light. Heidi Allen, an 18-year-old employee at the gas station convenience store, had been a police informant for 3 years. 3 years ago, the girl got into trouble when she was caught by the police during a party her sister wanted to attend. As she was a minor and had put a child who was with her in the car in a dangerous situation, Heidi faced significant problems. In exchange for dropping all charges, the 15-year-old girl made a deal and became a police informant. Although she was a confidential informant, her status was revealed by a bizarre accident. Before she disappeared, Heidi worked with a sheriff's assistant, Chris Van Patten, who accidentally dropped her informant card with a photo and the codename Julia Roberts near the store where she worked. The card was found by Heidi's colleague, Kristen Duell, who returned it to the police. Kristen claimed that she only told her mother about it, but even if the girl told the truth, it is unknown how long the card lay on the ground and how many bystanders could see it. Inmates who testified in court against Gary Thibodeau claimed that Heidi was worried about Gary because he was planning to involve her in illegal dealings with controlled substances. However, firstly, one of these inmates later recanted his statement. Secondly, Heidi's diary was found, where she detailed her life, and there was not a single mention of the Thibodeau brothers. Thirdly, the information that Heidi was, in fact, an informant, allows for the dismissal of these baseless insinuations. The newly revealed information provided an alternative theory about Heidi's abduction, especially considering that her status was compromised, and dangerous people could have learned that she worked for the police. Considering the new details, in 2014, after persistent demands from Gary's lawyers, searches were conducted in 2 cabins in the woods. One was literally opposite the place where Jennifer Westcott lived. Search dogs indicated the potential presence of remains near the cabin. Police found fresh shoe tracks at the site, and inside it was evident that someone had already dismantled the floorboards. However, the forensic examination conducted by the Bureau of Forensic Services did not detect any human remains. It's interesting that when Tanya Priest decided to share what she knew, numerous witnesses from the town immediately came forward, claiming to have heard James Steen, Michael Borer, and Roger Breckenridge boasting about Heidi's abduction. Some of these witnesses asserted that they had reported this to the police on multiple occasions. Even the key prosecution witness, Christopher Bivens, stated that Steen and Breckenridge looked much more like the individuals leading the girl out of the store. However, as he had never seen their photos before, he considered the Tibbett brothers as possible abductors. Around the same time, it was revealed that in 2004, Heidi's cousin, Melissa Searles, found an envelope in her mailbox containing a gold bracelet she had once gifted to Heidi. The envelope had no postage stamp, indicating that it wasn't sent through the mail, but was personally placed in the mailbox. Melissa claimed that she had not reported this discovery to the police for years because the entire family believed Heidi's abductor was already in prison, and there was no need to reopen the case. However, with the new abduction theory, she apparently felt compelled to share this information. In 2015, the appeal process regarding Gary's accusation began. The defense insisted on a new trial due to a wealth of newly revealed information. 52 witnesses, including 3 considered potential new suspects, testified. A key witness was a woman who drove past the DNNW store around 6 a.m. on April 3, 1994. She reported seeing an old, rust-covered van with no black stripe down the middle, confirming that it wasn't Richard Thibodeau's van. The defense tried to argue that the 3 men kidnapped the girl, forcing her into Michael Bohr's van, and took her to a cabin in the woods because they feared she would report them to the police. The men, of course, denied everything, but Michael Bohr slipped up by mentioning seeing Heidi's informant card near the store. Furthermore, Bohr told law enforcement that he wasn't a cruel person, so he couldn't have committed such a crime. However, this was untrue. Michael Bohr had previously been accused of kidnapping a young girl, making him, unlike the Thibodeau brothers, capable of such a crime. What's intriguing is that he was obsessed with this case, collecting a whole box of materials related to Heidi's abduction. One entry in his notes was particularly intriguing. He wrote as if a psychic told him that Heidi hid the bracelet behind the car seat. She added that Heidi hid an item where she was held, and all her family members would recognize it. Despite the abundance of new information, Gary lost the appeal after a year of hearings, and he was denied the opportunity for a new trial. From 2015 to 2018, subsequent judicial decisions also prohibited presenting new evidence due to doubts about the reliability of witnesses and the lack of sufficient proof to substantiate the alleged confessions of the 3 men. None of the 3, James Stein, Michael Bohr, or Roger Breckenridge, were charged in connection with Heidi's disappearance. Perhaps if Gary's lawyers had known about another crucial lead, they might have persuaded the judge to allow a new trial. The prosecutor informed the defense that he had provided them with all case materials. However, on December 13, 1994, he explicitly prohibited copying documents from a specific folder for the defense attorneys. Inside were 2 letters from the globally renowned expert in determining truthfulness, Murray Myron. His services were often sought by FBI agents, and he was asked to speak with a witness who might be the one who saw Heidi after her abduction. The expert concluded that Brent Moore's account of specific events related to Heidi was truthful and accurate. He did witness her being transported in a van, and she found refuge in a garage on the Barlow property in the town of Scriba. Brent was only 3 years old at the time of Heidi's abduction, and the expert was invited to verify whether the boy was telling the truth about the events of that day. The expert talked to the child, analyzed his drawings, and believed him. He advised looking for Heidi where the boy indicated. Interestingly, Brent knew Heidi before the abduction. His mother mentioned that during the Christmas holidays, after a visit to Richard Mitten, the boy's father, Brent mentioned seeing Heidi and that she gave money to Richard. When shown a photo of Heidi, the boy immediately recognized her and called her by name. Additionally, he accurately described her car. Brent added that 3 friends of his father were involved in Heidi's abduction, and the boy's mother remembered a conversation with her ex-husband on Easter Sunday in 1994, the day Heidi disappeared. She recalled how Richard suddenly claimed that 3 boys had kidnapped her. Who they were and whether they knew that Heidi was an informant is unknown. Investigators attempted to search the garage indicated by the boy, but couldn't conduct the search on either the garage or the adjacent area due to the lack of a warrant, and the homeowner did not allow the search. As evident, there are several theories about what might have happened to Heidi Allen besides the police's version implicating the Tibbetts brothers. It's possible that Stein, Breckenridge, and Bohr were the kidnappers, or perhaps friends of Brent Moore's father were involved. Since the girl was not found, there's also a more optimistic version suggesting that she entered a witness protection program. What if the police realized the danger they put Heidi in by making a teenager a confidential informant and then compromising her status? This could explain many unexplained aspects of the case. The appearance of her bracelet, the lack of signs of struggle in the store, the absence of evidence clearly pointing to any of the suspects. One might want to believe that she had to leave her family, but no one kidnapped her, and she is enjoying life somewhere in this world. Although one thing can be asserted almost certainly, when the sheriff's assistant dropped Heidi's informant card, he put an end to the life she had led until the age of 18. What truly happened on the morning of Sunday, April 3rd, 1994, remains unknown. It's possible that we may never find out. What we do know is that Gary maintained his innocence until his last breath. Gary Thibodeau passed away on August 12, 2018, at the age of 64, and his health did not allow him to live the additional 2 years to a potential conditional early release. Gary's departure means he will no longer have a chance to clear his name. Hope for another appeal in federal court died with him. He will remain a convicted inmate who abducted an 18-year-old girl and, according to many, is the second victim of this terrible and convoluted crime. On Saturday, April 5, 1997, the dispatcher of the Las Vegas, Nevada Rescue Service answered a call from a distressed man who reported the disappearance of his wife. The man, identified as Mark Hollinger, explained that his wife's name was Ginger Rios. They had been married for only 5 months and had just moved into a new house. Yesterday, they were shopping for their new home when Ginger entered a store and seemed to vanish into thin air. The police began an investigation. Detectives had never heard of a person disappearing so mysteriously, even in a city with its share of sins. They couldn't even begin to imagine how unusual this case would turn out to be, where you think you know exactly what happened, but it turns out you don't, and you have to start all over again. 20-year-old Ginger Rios lived and worked in Las Vegas. Her parents, George and Denise, adored their daughters, Ginger and her younger sister Daniela. The girls grew up surrounded by attention and care. Since childhood, Ginger dreamt of performing on stage, and she was fortunate to be born in Las Vegas because by the age of 20, she became a member of a successful group that performed in casino hotels. She also met a man named Mark Hollinger, who was 14 years older than her. Mark treated Ginger exceptionally well. He supported her in everything, and soon the young couple decided to legalize their relationship. In November 1996, when Ginger was only 20 and Mark was 34, they tied the knot. Some considered their union unusual because Ginger was a cheerful extrovert, while Mark was a quiet introvert. but they complemented each other perfectly and were already planning how to build their family nest. In the spring of 1997, Ginger found an amazing house available for rent with an option to buy. The house had a spacious basement, and Ginger could already imagine turning it into a dance studio. She liked the house so much that she dreamed of eventually purchasing it. However, to realize this dream, she and Mark needed a positive credit history. They needed a clear plan for how they would manage their finances, and for this purpose, Ginger wanted to buy books with relevant recommendations. In the city, a shop was gaining popularity that sold exactly the kind of books Ginger was looking for. It had a quirky name, Spy Shop. It was like a candy store for adults. In addition to books, its shelves held lockpicks, hidden surveillance cameras, police badges, car alarms, glasses that transmitted images, and even tools for removing store security tags from clothing. It was conveniently located in the city center. And so, on Friday, April 4th, literally the day after the young couple had moved into their new home, they went shopping, including for books. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark parked directly in front of the entrance. Ginger told her husband to wait in the car, and she took her wallet, which had some cash and her identification, and went inside. Mark expected her to come out very quickly, but he managed to finish his cigarette, and she still hadn't appeared. Thinking she might be waiting in line, he waited a little longer and then decided to check on his wife. The shop was small enough that he immediately realized Ginger was not there. He asked the man and woman behind the counter if they had seen Ginger and described her, of course. They replied that she had just come in, bought 2 books, and left. They added that she couldn't have gone far. Mark was surprised, but decided to look around in other stores, thinking maybe she needed to buy something else. He went into each one and asked if anyone had seen a slender brunette, but no one had seen her. His amazement knew no bounds. The car was parked right in front of the entrance. She couldn't have just slipped past it. Ginger had simply disappeared in broad daylight. Not knowing what else to do, Mark went to his wife's parents. Ginger's father, George, immediately thought that if there were surveillance cameras in any store, it would certainly be in the spy shop. They might be able to see at least which direction she went after leaving the store, since this shop not only stood out for its unique items, but also closed earlier. Compared to other places in Vegas, Mark and George hurried back in the hope that the storekeeper hadn't left yet. Unfortunately, the shop was closed, but Mark managed to identify the man and the woman getting into a van with a baby. They approached and explained the situation. On Saturday, April 5, 1997, the dispatcher of the Las Vegas, Nevada Rescue Service answered a call from a distressed man who reported the disappearance of his wife. The man, identified as Mark Hollinger, explained that his wife's name was Ginger Rios. They had been married for only 5 months and had just moved into a new house. Yesterday, they were shopping for their new home when Ginger entered a store and seemed to vanish into thin air. The police began an investigation. Detectives had never heard of a person disappearing so mysteriously, even in a city with its share of sins. They couldn't even begin to imagine how unusual this case would turn out to be, where you think you know exactly what happened, but it turns out you don't, and you have to start all over again. 20-year-old Ginger Rios lived and worked in Las Vegas. Her parents, George and Denise, adored their daughters, Ginger and her younger sister, Daniela. The girls grew up surrounded by attention and care. Since childhood, Ginger dreamt of performing on stage, and she was fortunate to be born in Las Vegas because by the age of 20, she became a member of a successful group that performed in casino hotels. She also met a man named Mark Hollinger, who was 14 years older than her. Mark treated Ginger exceptionally well. He supported her in everything, and soon the young couple decided to legalize their relationship. In November 1996, when Ginger was only 20 and Mark was 34, they tied the knot. Some considered their union unusual because Ginger was a cheerful extrovert, while Mark was a quiet introvert. But they complemented each other perfectly and were already planning how to build their family nest. In the spring of 1997, Ginger found an amazing house available for rent with an option to buy. The house had a spacious basement, and Ginger could already imagine turning it into a dance studio. She liked the house so much that she dreamed of eventually purchasing it. However, to realize this dream, she and Mark needed a positive credit history. They needed a clear plan for how they would manage their finances, and for this purpose, Ginger wanted to buy books with relevant recommendations. In the city, a shop was gaining popularity that sold exactly the kind of books Ginger was looking for. It had a quirky name, Spy Shop. It was like a candy store for adults. In addition to books, its shelves held lockpicks, hidden surveillance cameras, police badges, car alarms, glasses that transmitted images, and even tools for removing store security tags from clothing. It was conveniently located in the city center. And so, on Friday, April 4th, literally the day after the young couple had moved into their new home, they went shopping, including for books. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark parked directly in front of the entrance. Ginger told her husband to wait in the car, and she took her wallet, which had some cash and her identification, and went inside. Mark expected her to come out very quickly, but he managed to finish his cigarette, and she still hadn't appeared. Thinking she might be waiting in line, he waited a little longer and then decided to check on his wife. The shop was small enough that he immediately realized Ginger was not there. He asked the man and woman behind the counter if they had seen Ginger and described her, of course. They replied that she had just come in, bought 2 books, and left. They added that she couldn't have gone far. Mark was surprised, but decided to look around in other stores, thinking maybe she needed to buy something else. He went into each one and asked if anyone had seen a slender brunette, but no one had seen her. His amazement knew no bounds. The car was parked right in front of the entrance. She couldn't have just slipped past it. Ginger had simply disappeared in broad daylight. Not knowing what else to do, Mark went to his wife's parents. Ginger's father, George, immediately thought that if there were surveillance cameras in any store, it would certainly be in the spy shop. They might be able to see at least which direction she went after leaving the store. Since this shop not only stood out for its unique items, but also closed earlier. Compared to other places in Vegas, Mark and George hurried back in the hope that the storekeeper hadn't left yet. Unfortunately, the shop was closed, but Mark managed to identify the man and the woman. They decided to take it for analysis just in case. Rosgan got in touch with John Flowers to inform him that the police had visited his store. John was quite surprised that they hadn't found the girl yet, but readily answered all the questions. He explained that the bleach smell in the storeroom was because his dog used it as a toilet, and he had to clean up after it frequently. It was possible that's how a tiny drop of blood ended up there. As for the surveillance camera footage and the receipts for the book purchases, he would need to come to the store to look for them and hand them over to the police. Rosgan asked about the books Ginger bought, and this is where the surprise came in. One book was about creating a new identity, and the other was about contract killers. But why did Ginger buy these? Did she genuinely intend to disappear? Or did someone force her to buy these books and then kill her in one of the ways described in the second book? The tiny spot on the wall, possibly blued, turned out to be too small for analysis. Nevertheless, it wasn't very important since everyone already knew Ginger had been in the store and left. What was much more critical was figuring out where she went afterward. Indeed, there were several possible leads, especially considering Ginger's striking beauty and her public performances. Many people, including those with bad intentions, could have noticed her. Moreover, her father worked as a dealer in one of the most popular casinos in Vegas. When it comes to money, things can get messy. Days turned into weeks, and the hope of finding the girl alive was dwindling. The answer regarding Mark's car came, and guess what? They found nothing. No blood, no signs of struggle, nothing at all. At this point, Rosgan thought of John Flowers. He considered the possibility of checking the surveillance camera footage to see if someone had approached Ginger at the store's exit. However, he was too late. Exclaiming, "Where have you been all this time, guys?" John explained that he had reviewed the footage, saw Ginger entering the store, choosing the books, paying in cash, and leaving. Since no one had come for the video, it had been overwritten with new footage from the surveillance camera. John also couldn't find the receipt for the books, although he was certain that it should be somewhere. After this, John seemed unwilling to cooperate further with the detective, partly because his business had suffered due to police, media, and curious onlookers who crowded his shop after Ginger's disappearance. Selling lockpicks and fake police badges in a store that was already filled with law enforcement paraphernalia was understandable, but it put immense pressure on his small business. Rosgen understood this, and there was nothing to push John into talking with them. The case was put on the back burner, and the police had no new leads. In fact, the truth was there, but the detectives working on Ginger's case wouldn't discover it until several more months passed. On May 5th, in the Mojave Desert, nearly 400 miles from Vegas, a group of hunters stumbled upon a shallow grave. The medical examiner determined that the body in the grave belonged to a young, dark-haired girl aged 15 to 18. She had no identification on her, but the killer hadn't taken her quite distinctive jewelry, a pink ring with 3 colored stones and another ring shaped like wire loops, intertwined to form the letter M or W. Could the M signify Mark? Or perhaps it was a family heirloom, because Ginger's mother's maiden name was Watersworth. Hoping for public assistance, the local police published photos of the jewelry, but it would be a very long time before they would learn the truth. In the meantime, to crack the case, the detectives needed a lead or a body. Suddenly, on August 16, 1997, Jeff Rosgen received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified himself as a federal agent from Arizona and claimed to have a lead on the Ginger case. Rosgen was intrigued. The agent explained that John Flowers had been accused of selling illegal eavesdropping devices. But what did this have to do with Ginger? The agent continued. John had gone on the run because he didn't want to be arrested, but his wife, Cheryl Cizone, had been brought in for questioning. They were interested in her husband's whereabouts, but suddenly she started talking about Ginger Rios, who had disappeared in Vegas several months ago. The agent left the room to make a call to Rosgen. It was only now that Rosgen realized he had never formally questioned the owner of the spy shop, the last place Ginger was seen. And yet, Ginger's husband had mentioned that there was a man and a woman behind the counter. Rosgen asked the agents not to let Cheryl out of their sight and hurried to Arizona. Rosgen couldn't have anticipated what Cheryl's interrogation would reveal. When Ginger entered the shop to browse for books, John Flowers turned to Cheryl and asked her to go buy film. This wasn't unusual, as she often ran errands when they worked together at the store. Cheryl returned after about 10 minutes, and that's when Mark walked in. John told Mark that his wife had just left and couldn't have gone far. Mark thanked them and left. Cheryl's husband seemed like a different person. He had a terrified look on his face. She asked him what was going on, and the man replied, "I did something terrible. Whatever you do, don't go into the storage room." Cheryl had no idea what he meant, and it never occurred to her that her husband had harmed someone. However, his behavior unsettled her, and a little while later, she decided to check the storage room. Inside, she found the lifeless body of a young girl with a pool of blood surrounding her head. The carpet was also soaked in blood. The girl had been brutally beaten. It was the same girl who had entered the shop before John had sent Cheryl to get film. Cheryl felt disgusted, but her disgust quickly turned into fear when she realized John was right behind her. She hadn't even turned around when he grabbed her by the neck and ordered her never to speak about what had happened there, or something bad would happen to her as well as their child. Cheryl obeyed his command, but now that John was on the run, she decided to tell the truth. The detective wanted to know how John explained the situation to Cheryl. John told her that Ginger had a note from 2 of his former employees who were demanding money. Supposedly, the contents of the note and Ginger's insolence had infuriated John, and he had hit her so hard in the face that she fell back, hit her head, and died. However, Cheryl was convinced that this was a lie, and she had never seen the note. She did know for sure that John had taken garbage bags and spent several hours in the storage room, wrapping the girl's body in plastic bags and pouring bleach around her. He had told the employee that the dog had used the room as a restroom. Then, he put the body in his van and told Cheryl they needed to leave for Arizona immediately. That's when Ginger's father and husband approached them and pleaded for them to show the surveillance camera footage. John and Cheryl looked them in the eyes and lied. even though Ginger was lying just inches away from them. But that's not all. Cheryl also knew where her husband had buried the body. You see, they had gone to the Mojave Desert several times, John and Cheryl together. One time, John left Cheryl in the middle of nowhere and drove off with their baby and the girl's body. It's clear that he buried her, returned for Cheryl, and drove home. But this wasn't enough for him. They went to that location several more times so John could hide the shallow grave under a layer of concrete. It was only the last time that John came running back panicked and screaming, "They found her! They found her!" So Cheryl was quite certain that the police had already discovered Ginger's body. In any case, she agreed to show the detectives the location in exchange for no charges being filed against her. They accepted her offer because they didn't believe Cheryl had been involved in the murder. She led them to the spot. When they arrived in the desert, the local officers started connecting the dots between the body found by hunters in May and Cheryl's revelation. Cheryl asked them to stop the car and led them to the place her husband had visited. The police expected to find an empty grave, but instead, they reached a concrete slab that appeared untouched. There, they discovered the body wrapped in plastic bags. Thanks to a tattoo on the lower back, they had a preliminary identification as Ginger, but they decided to wait for DNA analysis before informing her family. This raised several unanswered questions. Were there two victims? Did John kill both? If so, why and who was the second girl? Now they could secure a search warrant for the Vegas store where they found traces of Ginger's blood. The DNA analysis later confirmed that the body in the desert also belonged to her. Mark, who had clung to the hope that his wife had simply left and started a new life, was devastated. He blamed himself, thinking he should have gone to the store with her. But how could he have imagined that a complete stranger, the owner of a popular and frequently visited store, would attack his wife, someone who was a mother and his loving spouse? John's attempt to hide didn't last long, and he was arrested at a hotel in Los Angeles. The extradition process began, during which the detectives discovered that there was no John Flowers, the owner of the spy store's chain. Instead, there was a 26-year-old Craig Jacobson wanted for crimes committed in Florida. From the age of 10, the boy had struggled with mental health issues, suffering from paranoia, borderline personality disorder, and likely antisocial personality disorder. He spent a year in a mental health clinic and then served 30 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. However, in 1995, he disappeared. In his place, John emerged. In addition to this revelation, the police found another potential victim of John or Craig. 2 months prior, a teenage girl had entered the Vegas store, but before she could even browse the merchandise, the owner approached her, slung her over his shoulder, and carried her into the storeroom without uttering a word. Her luck was incredible because another customer entered the store and scared John Flowers away, so he released her. This young woman didn't report the incident to the police out of fear, and her word against the word of a respected businessman could have been problematic. This, of course, was before the truth about John came to light. In the following months, psychiatrists examined him multiple times and deemed him unfit to stand trial. The prosecutor was convinced that Craig was faking it, but feared that the crime might go unpunished. He explained to Ginger's family that the best option would be to offer him a plea deal. Craig agreed to plead guilty to the murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison before he could be eligible for parole. As for the other girl, Craig mentioned her name as Mary Stoddard. She was the 18-year-old daughter of a chiropractor who had come to Vegas when he kidnapped and killed her. Ginger Rios's relatives hoped that he would be charged with Mary's murder, which could at least result in a life sentence or possibly even the death penalty. But here's the catch. Mary Stoddard, the daughter of a chiropractor as described by Craig, was alive and well. The body of the unidentified girl had already been reburied, but they had previously created a 3D model of what she might have looked like and obtained a DNA sample. This was all the police had, because as it unexpectedly turned out, the documents with information about her place of burial were lost, and no one knew in which grave she was located. In simpler terms, they had lost the body. Nevertheless, the police didn't give up on trying to identify who she was. In their list of missing persons, there were 300 people. Finally, on June 30th, 2010, after 13 years, they managed to identify the girl. More precisely, she turned out to be a teenage girl, as it was 15-year-old Christina Mary Martinez from Phoenix, Arizona. The girl lived in a group home, but constantly ran away from it because she was treated poorly there. She disappeared on May 3rd, 1997, while carrying a load of laundry to a self-service laundromat. Her path led her past the spy shop in Phoenix. Despite her difficult childhood, Christina had many people who loved her and were looking for her, including her friend Valerie, who never stopped searching for her. Valerie created various social media profiles in an attempt to draw attention to Christina's disappearance. Valerie would say, "No matter how long it takes, I will never stop thinking about her, and I won't give up. For me, she's not just a case number. I loved her. That's true love, never giving up on finding someone." Valerie couldn't have known that Christina was found just a week after her disappearance, in the desert, on her 16th birthday. As for the mystery of the girl's ring, the letter M on it signifies Martinez. Interestingly, the sister of the real Mary Stoddard mentioned that Craig had dated Mary when they were both younger. The guy was already behaving strangely back then, and if this is true, he could have become so fixated on Mary that after parting ways with her, he always sought women who resembled her to vent his anger. Considering that Mary is alive, but Craig called Christina Mary, it's possible that this was a fantasy he played out in his head while committing the crime, as many killers, especially serial killers, do. Most likely, Craig didn't plan his crimes but succumbed to impulsive acts, as was the case with the teenage girl from Vegas who survived because another customer scared the killer away. It's also possible that he targeted victims. As we know, Ginger had been to the store before her disappearance. Craig never revealed the reasons for his behavior, but investigators believe the murders aimed at violence against women because Ginger's underwear was found around her ankles. In any case, now, thanks to being charged with a second murder, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. It's remarkable that Craig was able to deceive so many people so easily. Mark and George, who were searching for Ginger, his own wife Cheryl, who had no inkling of his hidden nature, and even experienced Vegas police officers who had seen much in their careers. He truly appeared like an ordinary family man. And it makes you wonder where one can feel safe, if not with a store owner standing behind the counter with his wife and baby. Los Angeles, California. Every day of every year, young people from all over the country come here, hoping to make their dreams come true. Some want to become movie stars, others dream of singing on stage or working in the fashion industry, but not everyone shares these hopes and dreams. Among the stars, the glitz and the glamour, there are those who come to Hollywood to escape their past. An unworthy past. In a city where strangers never attract attention, they can easily blend into the crowd. In 2001, the dreams of one girl would be cut short after a night of bloody crime. Her connection with a famous Hollywood actor would turn her death into a sensation. But this story holds much more. Decades of cat-and-mouse games between the police and a calculating killer. A man whose knife pierced not one, but 4 young women. A serial killer who would become known as the Hollywood Ripper or the Boy Next Door. It happened almost 30 years ago in Glenview, Illinois. But even today, the Piccaccio family is haunted by memories of the day they learned that Tricia had been brutally murdered. 18-year-old Tricia Piccaccio had just graduated from high school. On an unusually cool and foggy Friday evening, August 13, 1993, Tricia and her school friends gathered to play a scavenger hunt. Then they all had dinner at a restaurant. Essentially, it was their last meeting before the young people started their university education. After a pleasant evening, the girl returned home a little after 1 in the morning. Holding her keys in her hand, she approached the door, intending to open it, but she never managed to do so. The next morning, her father woke up as usual, brewed himself a cup of coffee, and went outside to his van. The cup fell from his hand when his eyes were confronted with a scene too horrific to describe in words. He fell to his knees before his daughter and screamed. His scream echoed down the cul-de-sac, alarming all the neighbors. Despite the apparent futility of his efforts, Tricia's father tried to provide first aid to bring her back to life. When Tricia's mother learned what had happened, she fainted. Later, both parents were taken to the hospital in a state of shock. The police immediately began an investigation. Trisha had obviously been attacked, her arm twisted so severely that it broke, and she had received multiple stab wounds. But who could have wished such a death upon an 18-year-old girl loved by many? The investigators did their utmost, but a year after the murder, they had made no progress. However, about 12 months after Trisha's death, a neighbor's boy began attracting attention with his strange behavior. 17-year-old Michael Gargiulo was the best friend of Trisha's brother, Doug Piccaccio. Right after the incident, his reaction was quite natural. The boy was in shock over the murder of the neighbor girl he personally knew. He practically grew up in the Piccaccio house, often having dinner with the family. And just 2 days before her murder, Michael and another friend, Olson, had given Trisha a ride to her boyfriend's house. Overall, Michael was just a quiet guy to the Piccaccio family, a friend of their son who had never shown any oddities. But a year after Trisha's murder, the teenager started giving gifts to the family. It started with flowers he brought to Trisha's mother. Then he gave her and her husband a gift certificate for a restaurant dinner. And later, he bought Trisha's father a shirt. This was enough for detectives Jack Reed and Mark Baldwin from Cook County, Illinois, to take a closer look at the boy. A psychologist suggested that with these gifts, he was trying to atone for some sin. The detectives learned that Gargiulo had previously been involved in theft. Then Trisha's brother told the police about an interesting conversation he had with Michael. Michael once asked him if he knew who attacked Trisha. Would he be able to kill him? Doug said that the answer was known to any father or brother of a murdered girl. After this conversation, a detective called Doug and said that according to Michael, Doug had threatened him. It seemed that Michael at least knew more than he was saying. And when he was invited for a conversation at the station, he admitted that the morning after the murder, their mutual friend Eric Agazim had come to him and asked for help hiding something in his gym bag. Michael insisted he didn't know what was in the bag, but suspected it was the murder weapon, a knife. The detectives believed Michael, and when Agazim refused to talk to the police, he immediately became their main suspect. However, the investigators could not find any evidence against Eric, and the investigation stalled. For several years, there were no developments in the case. But one day, 5 years after Trisha's murder, Michael Gargiulo appeared on the Piccaccio family's doorstep. Clearly, he was still tormented by what he knew about the case, and he asked Trisha's mother if he could speak with her husband. The man wasn't home, so she let the boy wait for him. When Trisha's father entered the house, he immediately understood from Michael's face that they were in for a serious conversation. But before they could exchange even a few words, the door opened and Michael's father and one of his sisters came in. Without providing any explanation, they just took the boy away with them. Trisha's father immediately contacted the police and said they should talk to Michael again, but they were too late. Michael Gargiulo had left Glenview. Hollywood, 2001. 8 years and thousands of miles from the murder of Trisha Piccaccio. The bright lights of Hollywood have always attracted the young and beautiful. 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was no exception. For a girl from a small town in Northern California, life in Los Angeles was full of opportunities, new acquaintances, and entertainment. Ashley studied at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. Naturally, she dreamed of working in the fashion industry. In the meantime, she loved having fun with her close-knit group of friends who always spent time together. One evening, the beautiful and smiling girl caught the eye of a rising Hollywood star, 23-year-old Ashton Kutcher. The young people had crossed paths at parties thrown by mutual friends, so when Ashton invited Ashley out to dinner, no one was surprised. They spoke on the phone and agreed that he would pick her up and they would go to a restaurant together. Ashton arrived at about 10:45 p.m. The lights were on in all the rooms, and the young man confidently knocked on the door, but the girl did not open it. He knocked again, but again there was no response. Ashton thought he was too late. Ashley got upset and left with friends. However, before leaving, he peeked through the window by the door. The apartment was a bit messy, but Ashley had just moved in, and that was quite natural. He also saw red wine spilled on the carpet. Not giving it much thought, Ashton went home. As we know now, it was not wine at all. The body of 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin was discovered by her neighbor early Thursday morning. The girl entered the house and almost immediately saw her friend lying on the floor, blue and covered in blood. Fearing that the killer might still be in the house, she ran outside and called emergency services. But she was in vain to hurry. The killer had long since disappeared, and it was too late to help Ashley. Detectives who arrived at the crime scene, Tom Small, were confronted with a gruesome sight. Even after so many years, they clearly remember seeing an enormous amount of blood, with Ashley lying a little further away. They marveled at the rage the killer must have been in to stab her 47 times. But what astonished the detectives even more was what they didn't see, any clues that would tell them which direction to move. Ashley's friends provided the detectives with one and only one hint in this case, telling them about a young man who had lived next door to Ashley a few months ago. He introduced himself to her as Michael, a heating and air conditioning repairman. When Ashley's friend's heater broke, they invited Michael over. When he appeared at their house, the young man mentioned that he was a professional boxer, but when he first arrived in Hollywood in 1998, like many other young people, he nurtured another dream, to make it big on the screen. Quite quickly, he achieved a certain level of success in this field, landing a small role as a boxer in 1999. He handled it excellently, but something strange happened behind the camera. He behaved distantly, maybe even a bit shy, and didn't talk to anyone, keeping to himself. He seemed to have two sides to his personality. On one side, he was a clumsy guy with a lot of insecurities, but upon closer acquaintance, it became clear, if he wanted something, he would achieve it at any cost, shutting off all emotions. Michael had even once been arrested for theft, and it was this manner of behavior that puzzled Ashley and her friends. Ashley was a beauty, always open to communication, but Michael never invited her on a date or flirted with her. It seemed as if he was interested not in her, but in the lifestyle she led. Hanging out with actors like Vin Diesel and Jeremy Sisto, he became fixated on her. This wasn't particularly strange in itself, but one time, Ashley's friend Justin caught Michael sitting in his car at night across from her house, watching her apartment. The next day, when Michael dropped by, Justin directly asked him what it all meant. Michael's response shocked him. He allegedly couldn't go home because FBI agents from Chicago were waiting there to take DNA samples from him in connection with the murder of his best friend's girlfriend. Naturally, Justin suggested that Michael give a DNA sample if he had nothing to hide. Unexpectedly, Michael put his foot on the couch and showed a knife in a sheath, hinting that he was involved in the murder. Justin got angry and kicked the guy out of the house. Ashley and her friends brushed off Michael's story as another one of his tall tales. But what no one knew at the time was that it was true. Besides being an aspiring actor, amateur boxer, and heating repairman, Michael Gargiulo was also the prime suspect in the murder of Trisha Pacaccio. When Michael Gargiulo left Chicago, Illinois, he surely thought he was leaving the murder of Trisha far behind. But wherever he went, a new body would appear. In 2005, 12 years after Trisha's murder and 4 years after Ashley's death, Gargiulo was living in the Los Angeles suburb of El Monte. By this time, the cases of both Ashley and Trisha had been largely forgotten. But by a sinister twist of fate, yet another young woman was found dead in her apartment just steps away from Gargiulo's new residence. 32-year-old Maria Bruno had come to the United States from El Salvador and married young. Maria and her husband were raising 2 children aged 4 and 5, and one set of twins when they made the difficult decision to separate. The children stayed with their father while Maria adjusted to her new life. One fateful day, an unknown assailant removed the protective screen from the kitchen window of her ground-floor apartment, grabbed a knife right there on the spot, and entered the bedroom where she was peacefully sleeping. A woman of delicate build, defenseless, she lay asleep in the bedroom of her apartment, the very place where she should have felt completely safe. This attack was a nightmare for any woman, but it also became a nightmare for any detective because the perpetrator left behind a horrific scene. The ferocity with which the unknown attacker assaulted Maria was phenomenal. Investigators quickly ruled out robbery and a sexual motive. As with Ashley, Maria had no enemies capable of such an act. But this time, the assailant left something behind. Near the apartment, forensic experts found a booty with a drop of Maria's blood and an unknown person's DNA on it. This was both a clue and a dead end. No other evidence was found. Detectives, Mark Littlefield, immediately realized that investigating this case would be challenging. What they couldn't know at that moment was that another woman would have to face the killer to solve this crime. On April 28th at 12:30 a.m., a call came into the police reporting a stabbing. The victim was 26-year-old Michelle Murphy. On that day, she was alone in her apartment because her roommate was away. The story of what she went through sounds eerily familiar, but this woman was not ready to give up without a fight. At around 11:40 p.m., an intruder entered her apartment through a slightly open window. Once inside, he opened the front door, preparing an escape route. He then calmly walked to the bedroom. The man simply began stabbing Michelle, managing to strike her several times in the chest, shoulder, and right arm. Michelle woke up to the blows being inflicted by the intruder looming over her. For a moment, she didn't know whether it was a dream or if it was really happening. Realizing that she was in mortal danger, she tried to wrest the knife from him. She continued to attempt to grab the weapon, even as her hands bled from deep wounds. For a while, Michelle and the intruder struggled until she managed to pull her legs up to her chest and push him away. Understanding that he couldn't overpower Michelle, the intruder fled, not forgetting to say, "I'm sorry," before leaving. The perpetrator managed to escape before the police arrived, but during the struggle with Michelle, he cut himself with his own knife, leaving a long trail of blood as he fled. About 25 days after the detective sent the blood sample to the lab, forensic experts reported a DNA match. The DNA matched Michael Gargiulo perfectly. Within 24 hours, Gargiulo was arrested and charged with attempted murder. What stunned the detectives was where he lived, right across the street from Michelle. But Gargiulo's arrest for the attack on Michelle was only the beginning. The investigation would finally connect a series of unsolved murders that had begun 15 years earlier. It was evident that Michael Gargiulo wasn't particularly surprised when he was arrested by Sergeant Richard Lewis for the attempted murder of Michelle on the evening of June 6, 2008, as he specifically asked which department the officers represented. The fact that he wasn't sure which crime he was being arrested for was intriguing in itself. His question had a basis, as Michael Gargiulo's DNA had been found in the national database. It was entered there by the Cook County Police in Illinois. The Santa Monica detectives contacted Illinois investigators to find out why they had done so and learned that Gargiulo was suspected of murder. The Santa Monica investigators discovered that in 2002, Cook County Police, who had continued to investigate the Tricia Pacaccio case, asked the Los Angeles police for help in obtaining Michael's DNA. By an amazing coincidence, they approached Detective Tom Small, who was investigating Gargiulo's involvement in the murder of Ashley Ellerin. It took the detective over a year to locate the elusive air conditioning repairman, linking him to Tricia's case. And 5 years later, that very DNA sample would help connect Gargiulo to the attack in Santa Monica. But that was far from the end of the story. The Santa Monica investigators called the El Monte police, suspecting that the attack on Michelle might be related to the murder of Maria Bruno. The El Monte detectives returned to Gargiulo's old apartment to search it and found the missing shoe cover. The unknown DNA found on one shoe cover also matched Gargiulo. With the necessary evidence in hand, the detectives had no doubt about the identity of the killer. The Los Angeles prosecutor decided that there was enough evidence to start a case against Michael Gargiulo. On September 4, 2008, while Mike was in jail for the attack in Santa Monica, he was charged with the additional murders of Ashley and Maria. However, the California investigators could not find an answer to one question. Why didn't the Cook County Police in Illinois arrest him years ago for Tricia's murder, thus preventing the deaths of 2 more girls? After all, in 2003, the police had linked the DNA sample obtained by Los Angeles detectives to the unknown DNA found under Tricia's nails. These were the pieces of evidence that could have helped arrest him. Even Tricia's family was confident that this was solid evidence, but the prosecutor decided not to open the case, arguing that the DNA alone was not enough to prove that Gargiulo was at the crime scene when Tricia was attacked. The DNA could have been left not only during the struggle for her life, but also after a casual touch. Mike was a family friend and often visited the house, which was the main obstacle in accusing Mike of Tricia's murder. The prosecutor's office explained that since the lab used one swab to collect DNA from Tricia's nails, it was impossible to determine whether the DNA was on the nails or under them. The difference in this case was enormous. A simple but evidently imperfect laboratory procedure tied the prosecutor's hands. Michael wasn't charged with Tricia's murder until 2011, when a man who worked as a bouncer at a Los Angeles nightclub with Gargiulo recalled seeing him in the news and remembered that Gargiulo had boasted to him and another club employee about killing a girl in Chicago. Gargiulo did not mince words, describing how he committed the crime and allowed her father to find her on the doorstep. After receiving the men's testimonies, the Illinois prosecutor charged Michael Gargiulo with Trisha's murder. This was the news the Piccaccio family had been waiting to hear for 18 years. It didn't ease their pain, but the thought that the guilty party would be punished brought some relief. Gargiulo, evidently doubting that he would be found innocent, planned to escape from El Monte jail. He made makeshift handcuffs out of plastic and intended to attack a guard, steal a police car, and flee to Mexico. However, his plan failed, and he spent several years in Los Angeles jail awaiting trial. After several delays, the trial began on May 2, 2019. It lasted 3.5 months, with over 200 people testifying. Among them was Ashton Kutcher, who recounted the night 18 years ago when he arrived at Ashley Ellerin's door moments after she had been killed. Kutcher testified clearly and directly. He had met Ashley 2 months earlier at a friend's party. At that time, he was in a relationship, but by the time Ashley invited him to her housewarming party 2 weeks later, he had broken up with his girlfriend. Ashley was also single, so Ashton asked her out to dinner. He arrived at her place quite late because he had been watching the Grammy Awards with friends. When Ashley didn't open the door, he simply went home. Upon learning that she had been murdered, Ashton immediately called the police and informed them that his fingerprints were on her door. Michelle Murphy also testified. She recalled the night of the attack and then spoke about the immense happiness she felt when she became a mother after everything that had happened. However, all she could think about were the parents of Trisha, Ashley, and Maria, whose daughters had been so heartlessly taken from them by this monster. After giving her testimony, she went downstairs to her husband, hugged him, and cried. Gargiulo's lawyer built his defense on the claim that his client was mentally ill and did not understand what he was doing. However, the prosecution proved that Gargiulo had stalked his victims for a long time, waited for the right moment to attack, and planned each assault meticulously, knowing how to avoid punishment. This indicated that he knew exactly what he was doing. Additionally, a former friend of Michael's testified that Gargiulo frequently searched the internet for information on forensics and how to evade punishment for crimes. The prosecutor argued that there was indeed an intimate component to his attacks, even though he did not sexually assault the women. It was the killings themselves that brought him pleasure. On August 15, 2019, Michael Gargiulo was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On July 16, 2021, he was sentenced to the highest penalty. He will be extradited to Illinois, where he will face trial for the murder of Trisha Piccaccio. In Illinois, the punishment for first-degree murder ranges from 25 years to life imprisonment. The psychologist who was asked to analyze Gargiulo's attacks stated that the similarities between the crimes allowed for identifying the characteristic features of his murders. First and foremost, there was the audacity of the attacks. He did not strike in the dead of night but chose times when neighbors or passers-by could see him. Additionally, attacking with a knife involved very close contact, allowing him to look his victims in the eyes. What he did to the young women allowed him to strip them of their identity and humiliate their human dignity. The psychologist suggests that since they were neighbors and he could frequently observe the beautiful women, he put them on a pedestal. At the same time, he harbored a kind of contempt for them because he desired them, which gave the women power over him. Gargiulo felt the need to rectify this situation. He believed he could regain control only in the most horrifying way, not just by killing them, but by stripping away all their humanity. During one of the interrogations, Michael remarked that just because 10 women were killed and his DNA was found on them, it didn't mean he had killed anyone. This statement, along with testimonies from other witnesses, led the police to suspect that Michael might be responsible for the deaths of 10 people, even though he is officially accused of only 4 attacks. Since Michael Gargiulo traveled between Illinois and California, detectives believe there could be more victims. Megan Carr and Cherish DeSantis seemed destined to become best friends. The girls were born just a day apart, attended the same school, clubs, and activities together, and their parents thought each of them had 2 daughters. Both of their families were quite wealthy. Megan's father owned and managed a company specializing in drilling water wells. It had been a family business since the 1940s, bringing in around $2 million annually. However, by 1992, Megan's parents had divorced, and she lived with her mom, Shirley. As for Cherish's father, He was a well-known tobacco auctioneer in town and nationwide for over 30 years. While such auctions are not as common now back then, it was a thriving business. In the spring of 1992, 16-year-old Megan and Cherish were popular students at Thomasville High School in Georgia. Their families made sure their daughters behaved appropriately, although there was never a need for concern. The girls never caused trouble, excelled in their studies, and all their activities were within the bounds of propriety. Even during vacations, they looked forward to peaceful beach getaways rather than raucous parties. Thursday, March 26, 1992, marked the last day before spring break. After that, students could forget about school until April 6th. Megan and Cherish were eager to squeeze in some beach time. Not in Thomasville, of course, but in Florida, less than 60 kilometers away. For Thomasville students, crossing the border to visit the beaches of Tallahassee was a common practice. It took about 2 hours and the trip was quite enjoyable. The young women preferred a single beach that wasn't overrun by tourists. It was called Bold Point, a picturesque 13-kilometer shoreline, popular for birdwatching, wildlife, and yes, alligators, hence its name. Overall, it was a wonderful spot to relax under the sun and take a swim. That was Megan and Cherish's plan. Therefore, at 10 o'clock on Friday morning, the girls packed their swimsuits, towels, and, hopping into Megan's new Honda, headed for Florida, planning to spend the entire day at the beach. They intended to return home that same evening. Some of their friends were supposed to join them, but at the last moment, some had second thoughts or urgent matters came up. The girls arrived at Alligator Point Beach around noon. Megan parked the car, they grabbed their towels, changed into their bikinis, and turned on the rock station on the boombox. After wandering leisurely along the beach for a few hours, a married couple noticed the girls and, seeing that they were resting in a somewhat unusual pose, one girl lying on top of the other, decided not to disturb them. The couple veered wide around them to avoid causing any disturbance. However, on their way back, they realized that the girls hadn't moved at all. Even as they openly stared at them for minutes, the girls remained still. The man asked his wife to stay put while he approached them closer. He saw blood and shouted to his wife that the girls appeared to be dead and they needed to call the police. Alligator Point Beach was a family-friendly beach where visitors enjoyed walks and picnics. The police were aware that there had never been attacks on women at this beach. Therefore, the arriving officers were also horrified by what had happened. The ongoing contrast of the radio continuing to play rock music added to the chilling atmosphere of the murder scene juxtaposed against the carefree beach setting. The officers found the girls' identification and conducted a preliminary identification. They were 16-year-old Megan and Cherish. In addition to their documents, all their belongings were nearby: wallets, cash, Megan's car keys, beach bags, and towels. The girls were in bikinis, so the police ruled out robbery or violence against them as motives. Megan had a towel draped over her head soaked in her blood. Cherish lay on Megan with a head wound as well. As later determined by the medical examiner, each girl had been shot twice in the head from close range with a .38 caliber firearm. There was a lot of blood around the bodies. Besides the bullet holes, there were no other injuries on the victims, as if they had been caught off guard and didn't fight for their lives. Therefore, reluctantly, the police had to consider whether this was someone the girls knew. It seemed unlikely that a stranger could have approached so closely without the victims screaming or attempting to escape. And who could have known they would be relaxing in this isolated part of the beach? It appeared that the attack was planned, and someone had been monitoring them and traveled all the way from home. But who would want to kill two schoolgirls? The police began interviewing possible witnesses among local residents and regular beachgoers because although it was a remote part of the beach, families were nearby and cars were parked in the lot. They should have heard gunshots or the victims' cries. One regular beachgoer indeed heard sounds around 12:30 that he mistook for fireworks. Now, of course, it was evident he had heard 4 gunshots. Shortly afterward, a car passed by him that he hadn't seen there before. It was a long blue car resembling a Chevrolet Nova or something similar. Officers also went to the parking lot where Megan's car was parked and noticed something strange. There were plenty of open parking spots, but someone had blocked Megan's car in such a way that she couldn't leave. It wasn't a Chevrolet, but the car turned out to be blue. Approaching, the officers saw a man inside with a camera on his lap. When asked what he was doing there, the man explained that he had been photographing birds in the area all day. He had seen people, of course, but not teenage girls dancing on the beach. He rather aggressively stated that he had no interest in watching girls dance on the beach. Curiously, who mentioned anything about dancing on the beach? The man was taken in for questioning and a weapon was found in his trunk. The police were already rubbing their hands, thinking they had quickly solved the case. During questioning, the man admitted he had seen the girls but denied any involvement in the murders, claiming they were alive when he passed by them on the beach. He even underwent a polygraph test. The gun found in his trunk turned out to be a completely different caliber than the murder weapon, so the suspect was released. The bartender from the establishment near the beach where the girls died recalled a strange incident that occurred on the day of the murders involving an unusual visitor. He entered as soon as the establishment opened, ordered a Bloody Mary cocktail, but the bartender wasn't quite ready for service due to a delay, so she told the man the drink would be on the house. However, he insisted on paying. This alone wouldn't have been odd, except for his words. "You'd better take this money because it's the first and last time I'll come in here." Whether he meant to offend her or not, he stayed in the bar for 40 minutes and left shortly before the presumed time of Megan and Cherish's murders. Meanwhile, it was getting dark, approaching dinner time, when Megan and Cherish were expected home, but they hadn't returned. Megan's mother called Cherish's parents to see if her daughter was with them, but they hadn't seen her either. The woman was a bit worried, but she knew the girls were responsible and assumed they were just running a bit late. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The Florida police notified their colleagues in Thomasville about what had happened and asked them to inform the families of the victims. How can anyone prepare someone for the news that their loved one will never come home again? It was a tragedy for both families. They felt as though they had lost two daughters. Although the officers tried to be as tactful as possible, they needed to ask several questions. The girls' relatives explained that they spent almost all their time together, either at Megan's house or Cherish's. The only other person they spent a lot of time with was Alex, Cherish's boyfriend. The families insisted that Alex had nothing to do with the murders, but everyone was considered a suspect until ruled out by the police. Moreover, they were troubled by how the killer got so close to the girls. This meant they didn't see him as a threat. Therefore, suspicion fell on Alex next. But he seemed genuinely grieving, just like everyone else, unable to believe they were gone. The police were convinced that Alex must have known where the girls would be hanging out. He replied that he could have found out if he wanted to, but they never discussed it. Additionally, when Megan and Cherish went to the beach, he was at work in the factory. His colleagues indeed confirmed the young man's alibi, so the police left Alex alone and allowed him to mourn the loss of his girlfriend and her friend. The police had no solid leads and disclosed almost nothing to the public. Therefore, all sorts of wild rumors circulated about the motive for the murders. Some speculated that the girls were random victims of drug smuggling, with smugglers landing on the beach and killing unwanted witnesses. However, there was no evidence of any boat landing on the beach. Others recalled that the beach used to be a nudist beach and suggested the girls might have been targeted for occasionally sunbathing topless there. But Megan and Cherish were in bikinis, so this theory didn't make sense. The most plausible theory was that someone was upset about Cherish's father's tobacco business, perhaps due to a failed deal, and took out their anger on his daughter. However, the police couldn't find any evidence to support this theory. Time passed, and the police couldn't make progress. There was neither a motive nor evidence to find the culprit. Even experienced police officers didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, societal pressure was mounting. The only lead that demanded substantial police resources was the blue Chevrolet Nova. Police spoke with all owners of similar blue cars in the state of Florida. In Georgia, they couldn't do this because in 1992, the state lacked a database of car colors. Officers went door to door, interviewing car owners. Several times they felt they were onto something, such as when they discovered that an owner of a similar model lived across the street from one of the girls, or when they found a former convict acting suspiciously at the crime scene. But all these promising leads didn't amount to anything. Suddenly, a woman called the sheriff's office in Tallahassee. She claimed to know who shot the girls because she was on the beach when it happened. This call was a godsend for the police, giving them renewed hope that the case would be solved. She said the man's name was Sam Haynes, and he lived near the beach. However, when asked to identify herself, she hung up. She had called from a payphone, so tracing her location was impossible. Although the police desperately wanted to find her, as she confessed to being involved in the crime, they couldn't locate her. It turned out that despite Sam living near the beach, he was actually working at a construction site in Atlanta, Georgia, 6 hours away from the crime scene. Investigators suspected Sam might have followed the girls when they drove that day. Upon learning he was being sought, Sam contacted the police himself. He claimed he was at work in Atlanta on March 27th and insisted someone was lying about him. Sam suspected it was Linda, his ex-wife's sister. As it turned out, Sam was not mistaken. Linda accused her former brother-in-law of the high-profile murder of the two girls as revenge for mistreatment of her sister. It's remarkable she took this step, considering she could have been arrested herself. In any case, detectives spent a lot of time in vain. If it weren't for the next crucial event, they wouldn't have solved the case no matter how hard they worked. On Friday, May 15th at 10 a.m., the sheriff's office received another call. It was a resident of Tallahassee claiming to know who killed Megan and Cherish. The killer was her ex-boyfriend, Robert Neil Rodriguez. This sounded familiar to the investigators, who had lost hope of it being anything other than another scorned ex. So they asked her why she thought he had killed someone. But the woman said he confessed himself. Robert had called her the previous evening and told her everything, convincing her he was serious. He begged her to wait until the next morning to call the police. She kept her promise. One detective thought the man's name sounded vaguely familiar and reviewed the list of people involved in the case. Robert's name was indeed on it because he owned a blue car, though not a Chevrolet Nova, but a 1979 Plymouth Volare, a model very similar to the Chevrolet. The caller couldn't provide any more information, particularly about Robert's current location, but she knew he planned to leave town and was armed. She added that he had previously lived with his mother in Tallahassee, about an hour's drive from Alligator Point Beach. Robert's neighbors confirmed he had moved out of the apartment on May 2nd or 3rd. During the search of his apartment, books on death and other items suggesting a specific, possibly depressed state of mind were found, but no weapon. The police stations around the country were informed of the new suspect's description. Meanwhile, the investigators tried to recall what Robert had told them that caused them to strike his name from the suspect list. But as they began to delve into his past, they were horrified to realize that he was a former police officer from Portland, Oregon. He served in the police force for 2 years, from 1975 to 1977. The officers were shocked because the murderer who committed such a terrible crime could have been one of them. When they approached him about his blue car, he immediately claimed to be a former police officer himself and offered to undergo a polygraph test. But the police stated that it was just a routine check and left him alone. As it turned out, they were wrong. Incredibly, just 8 hours after the woman's call at 6 p.m., the police phone rang again. This time, it was a man introducing himself as Robert Neil Rodriguez. Being a former police officer, he immediately provided his driver's license number to prove it was really him. Then Robert convinced the officer that he was the one who committed the murder. He simply confessed. Robert provided the police with information known only to the killer. For example, the fact that Megan had a towel on her face. He even said he was calling from a payphone on the road in New Mexico, heading to the Grand Canyon National Park, driving his Plymouth. Robert's voice sounded so detached and subdued that detectives feared he might do something foolish. Detectives asked him to surrender to help him, but Robert said it was too late for him and he wouldn't go to prison. He feared that as a former police officer, he would have a hard time in prison. Detectives hurried to find the man, but were also afraid to show his photo in the news. They feared that if Robert's photo appeared in the news, he might do something irreversible, or someone else might take matters into their own hands. The next morning, on May 16th in New Mexico along the route to the Grand Canyon National Park, a blue Plymouth was found on the highway. The license plates on the car were from Utah, but when they checked them, it turned out they had been stolen on May 8th from a parking lot in Utah. The car was just parked on the highway. Inside sat a man who matched the description of Robert Rodriguez. He looked as though he had lost consciousness. A vial with a white substance dangled from a leather lace around his neck, and a handwritten note lay on the dashboard. The note was addressed to anyone who found the man. In it, Robert, confirming it was indeed him, wrote that he had taken cyanide and under no circumstances should anyone try to revive him with artificial respiration, as the rescuer might get poisoned themselves. On the passenger seat was a notebook, where Robert explained in more detail that he had consumed cyanide mixed with scotch for the parents of Megan and Cherish, and to avoid imprisonment. There was a gun in the car, but it was a .22 caliber, not the one used to fire the deadly bullets. However, the most intriguing part was that according to Robert's final promise, the Florida police should expect a letter from him detailing how and why he killed the girls. When the parents of the girls heard the news, they were shocked and puzzled. Megan's father wondered, could they have hired a former police officer as a hitman? He couldn't fathom the idea that a stranger could shoot his daughter just like that. He believed it must have been a professional killer. Meanwhile, Cherish's mother, upon learning about the discoveries during the search of Robert Rodriguez's home, wondered if he was a serial killer who hated women. If he was so obsessed with killings, shouldn't he have killed more than 2 people by his age? Of course, at that time, she didn't know how close to the truth she was. And then, on May 18th, the first letter from Robert surfaced. It didn't go to the police, but to a newspaper. In it, he disclosed where the police should look for his body because initially Robert had intended to reach the canyon. He also claimed that he would be sought in connection with 3 committed murders. Incredibly, he admitted that the police themselves wouldn't have been able to link him to 3 murders, but he simply couldn't stay silent. In 1984, he killed another innocent girl, Valerie Hunt. That his 3rd victim was Valerie Hunt. He killed her in 1984, and the police will receive all the details about the murders by mail. Valerie was a 22-year-old student from Tallahassee. Her body was found in September of that same year near the pond. The police initially treated the case as a disappearance, possibly suspecting she had run away, but everyone who knew her didn't believe she would willingly disappear. Her boyfriend reported her disappearance when her boss called to say she hadn't shown up for work, although she was always reliable. Like Megan and Cherish, Valerie went to the pond to swim and sunbathe. She frequented the area often, was a strong swimmer, and it was incredible that she drowned. The cause of her death was undetermined because her body was heavily decomposed. Now, finally, it became clear that she was Robert Rodriguez's first victim. On the 19th, finally, a letter arrived at the police, after which Robert's messages were received by the families of all his victims, his friends, and former girlfriends with whom he had good relationships. The police didn't disclose the details of the message until they had verified every word from the man. They asked the families of the girls to do the same, but Megan's father decided differently. He saw both letters, Megan and Cherish's families, and said they were practically identical, with no hint of an apology in either. Robert revealed the details of how he committed the crime, although Megan's father would have preferred him not to. On March 27th, around noon, Robert entered a cafe near Alligator Point Beach. It was he who ordered a Bloody Mary cocktail and insisted on paying for it. The bartender confirmed this when she saw his picture. He left the establishment around 1 p.m. and headed to the beach. Witnesses who found the bodies passed Megan and Cherish at 1:45, and they were already dead. That is, after leaving the bar, he immediately went to the beach where he saw the girls and killed them. He was haunted by a fantasy in which he raped, beat, and killed a girl. These thoughts had plagued him for a long time, and he couldn't find an explanation or justification for this obsession. And though he dreamed of violence, he assured the police and the girls' families that he hadn't done anything like that to Valerie, Megan, or Cherish. After killing Valerie, he told himself he could live a normal life, and that if he did it again, he would kill himself. And then, when he came across Megan and Cherish, he couldn't hold back. They did nothing to provoke him. He had never met them before, but chose them because they were young, attractive, and vacationing in a remote area. It was all over in seconds. He shot Megan first. Cherish began to scream and back away. Then he shot her. Megan had a towel in her hand and it fell over her head when he shot. Then he shot each one more time to make sure they were dead before fleeing. All the letters were written matter-of-factly, and there was practically no emotion in them. It must have been very difficult to read them. Megan's mom again raised the question that worried everyone. How could he harbor this passion for murder for 8 long years before killing again? Megan's father speculated that Robert became engrossed in religion, then lost faith again, and therefore killed again. But investigators noticed another interesting pattern. He divorced shortly before Valerie's murder in 1984. And he had just broken up with his girlfriend before Megan and Cherish's murders. One of his church friends said he sometimes got angry about relationships. Maybe that's how he vented his anger. And his mother died on Easter morning in 1992, and since he no longer had any truly close people, he decided to confess everything. The pastor of his church said Robert was struggling internally. His loving and caring nature fought against the evil inside him. He stuttered about suicide at least twice, and he was taking medication previously used to treat depression, but its effect was linked to aggressive behavior and thoughts of harming himself. When people gathered for service on Sunday, May 17th, and didn't see Robert, they couldn't believe what they had learned about him. They called him Bob, sincerely loved him, helped others, and he wasn't the person they read about in the news. One woman said it was so much like him, warning that he had taken cyanide. Another admitted she wouldn't be able to read news about criminals and judge them as before because she knew one personally. She will think about the people who loved this man, because they exist, and she is one of them. It's clear that Robert didn't understand the reason behind his obsession and didn't want to harm innocent strangers. It's unfortunate that he couldn't overcome his inner demons and stop himself before taking the lives of 3 innocent individuals, Valerie Hunt, Megan Carr, and Cherish DeSantis, and breaking the hearts of both their loved ones and his own. Eliza Levy was young, worked a lot, and loved adventure. She had her whole life ahead of her, but suddenly she was kidnapped by strangers. They took her deep into the forest, tied her to a tree, and threatened to brutally harm her and her family if she didn't obey. Her relatives were beside themselves with worry. An elite group of police agents got involved. But could Eliza do something herself to escape? Using an unusual tool, she put a risky plan into action. Then, one night in the dark, she noticed some lights. Was this the end of the nightmare? Or would it start again with renewed force? The 24-year-old Eliza Levy can be called a child of 2 worlds. Her father, James Levy, was an American born and raised on Long Island, just a few miles from New York City, while her mother, Alicia Ortiz, worked as a school teacher in Ecuador. They fell in love when James was a Peace Corps volunteer in the 1980s and soon married. Of their 4 children, 2 received dual citizenship in both the U.S. and Ecuador. James believed that raising their children in the U.S. was best, but he unexpectedly found them drawn to the peaceful, slow-paced life of South America. So the couple built a home in the middle of the Ecuadorian jungle, just across the border from Colombia. Together, they founded the organization Al Tropico to protect the invaluable tropical forest surrounding them. Eliza, the eldest of the 2, adored life in the wilderness. Her adventurous spirit kept her constantly on the move, always ready to search for new bird species or explore uncharted territory. When she returned to Ecuador, she enrolled in university, where she studied botany and biology. It was here that she found a serious passion: cycling. She organized weekly races through the streets of Quito and took long trips across the country. Her other passion became Al Tropico, the group founded by her father. She volunteered, guiding school children through the jungle, teaching them to identify hundreds of species of local birds. The dense jungles of Ecuador are home to many plants and birds, but they also provide the perfect hideout for criminals. And the country's northern border is notorious for its security problems. Illegal militarized Colombian organizations smuggle contraband and prohibited substances into Ecuador and often use small villages on the Ecuadorian side as refueling stations. In 2009, the most infamous of these organizations was FARC, Colombia's left-wing extremist guerrilla group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. It was FARC that held politician Ingrid Betancourt hostage in the jungle for 6 years, a story that spread across the world. However, when you grow up in a region, even one as troubled as this, life from the inside often feels completely different. This is why Eliza never felt unsafe in any part of Ecuador. And it was precisely for this reason that she suspected nothing when a man called her, explaining that he was from her hometown and, as an official, wanted to launch a new bird research project in another city near the Colombian border. Eliza agreed to meet him to discuss the details, as long as he sent a driver to pick her up. They settled on that arrangement. On Saturday, October 17, 2009, one of Eliza's brothers dropped her off at the meeting spot with the driver of an Isuzu Trooper. Eliza got into the SUV, but before doing so, she asked her brother to write down the vehicle's license plate number just in case. At first, everything seemed normal. The driver was calm and friendly, but an hour into the drive, he picked up 2 strangers, claiming they needed a ride. In reality, they had other plans. The men pressed the barrel of a gun to Eliza's neck and demanded that she stay quiet. The strangers were driving Eliza to an unknown destination, but her family in Quito had no idea. The last they'd heard was that she was heading to a meeting about tropical birds. When she didn't return to the city as expected and failed to call, they became worried. Even then, they didn't think the worst, assuming instead that a mudslide, a fairly common occurrence in Ecuador, might have delayed her. At the time, Eliza's father, James, was in San Francisco attending an environmental conference. The family didn't want to alarm him, but after 2 days of growing panic, they sent him a message. On Monday, October 19, 2009, 2 days after Eliza's disappearance, her mother, Alicia, received a call from a stranger. He told her not to worry, that Eliza was fine and with them in Colombia. The caller made it clear that Eliza had been kidnapped, but was in no rush to make demands. Eliza's father caught the next flight back to Ecuador. At first, the Levy family hoped to resolve the situation without involving the police. The question they faced wouldn't have crossed the mind of someone from any other country. Was it even worth calling the authorities? In Ecuador, not everyone trusts the police. Even in the case of a serious crime like kidnapping, some Ecuadorians try to solve the problem on their own. But there was another option. Ecuador's police force has an elite unit specifically for dealing with kidnappings known as UNAS. This unit, made up of 100 specially trained agents, is tasked with tracking down kidnappers and helping families through the harrowing ordeal of a loved one being abducted. They assist with negotiations, ransom discussions, and, when possible, organize rescue operations. The Levy family contacted UNAS. It's worth noting that while kidnapping an American in Ecuador is not unheard of, it is usually a less dangerous scenario, where a tourist is held in a taxi for a few hours and forced to withdraw cash from an ATM. This time, however, the situation was far more serious. The most terrifying possibility was if the kidnappers had ties to FARC, the Colombian guerrilla group. In that case, Eliza could be taken deep into the jungle and held for years. Given this, the UNAS specialists advised the family to also contact the U.S. Embassy in Quito. On the morning of Wednesday, October 21st, 4 days after the kidnapping, FBI agents, UNAS officers, and other agents arrived at the Levy home. They promised to try to track down the kidnappers, but they emphasized that the most critical and delicate task in securing Eliza's release would be communication with the criminals. The leader of the kidnappers had left Eliza's mother with a phone number, but who would have the courage to call him? The agents decided that Eliza's father, James Levy, who was known by the Spanish version of his name, Jamie, was capable of handling the delicate task of communicating with the kidnappers. With the agent's guidance, of course. They handed him a sheet with potential phrases the kidnappers might use and how he should respond. After a brief briefing, James made the call to the leader of the kidnapping gang. He had to ask his wife to leave the room to avoid breaking down in front of her. The conversation lasted 4.5 minutes, and the kidnappers didn't allow James to speak with his daughter, claiming she wasn't with them. However, the most important information they gave him was that Eliza had been kidnapped for ransom, and they would later reveal the amount. James held himself together remarkably well during the call, but that evening, after the agents left, he locked himself in his office with a bottle of whiskey and broke down in tears. He was overwhelmed with guilt, blaming himself for what had happened. For years, he had worked with various organizations and groups on both sides of the Ecuador-Colombia border, and he had arrogantly believed that his family was safe from harm. At the same time, Eliza was being held in a remote area of Ecuador, less than 200 miles from her family. She had no way of knowing that they were fighting for her release. All she knew was that the past few days had been the most painful, disorienting, and terrifying of her life. After the strangers jumped into the SUV, they pressed a gun to her neck and promised that nothing would happen to her as long as she behaved sensibly. They threw a towel over her head, cuffed her hands, and gagged her. Then they dragged her from the front passenger seat to the back, laying her on the floor. One of the men moved to the front while another stayed in the back to guard her. Eliza didn't even think about resisting. Everything had happened so fast that she hadn't fully realized she had been kidnapped. It felt like a dream, but it was a nightmare she couldn't wake from. They drove off-road for over an hour, bouncing along rough terrain. Then, the vehicle came to a sudden stop. The door opened. She heard someone approach. A man told her to get out and walk with them. Eliza recognized his voice. It was the man who had arranged the meeting about tropical birds. They led her somewhere to what she sensed was an even more dangerous and isolated place. From the moment she fell into the hands of her captors, Eliza resolved to remain calm and alert. She knew that one wrong move could cost her life. When the captors finally removed the blanket from her head, Eliza saw that they were heavily armed, their faces concealed by ski masks. They told her they were part of a paramilitary group and that the threat extended not only to her, but also to her family in Quito. They claimed they had stationed people around her family's home and warned that if she made any foolish moves, her family would suffer. The men asked if she had a GPS chip implanted under her skin, a measure that wealthy individuals in Latin America sometimes take to track their location in case of kidnapping. That's when Eliza realized that the gang believed she came from a wealthy family. She assured them this wasn't the case, but the men were convinced that her American father would pay a large ransom for her. After that, they forced her to record a message on a phone for her parents. She spoke under their direction. "Mom, Dad, I'm okay. Just do what they say and don't talk to the police." She tried to speak calmly, knowing that her mother would be terrified beyond words. The men then took her phone, watch, and tablet from her backpack, but left her with a change of clothes, a book, and something else she wouldn't remember until much later. They chained her to a tree, next to which they had hastily set up an improvised tent. Under the guidance of the agents, Eliza's father, James, negotiated with the kidnappers regarding the ransom. He knew that kidnappings were common in Ecuador, but he had always believed his family wouldn't be affected, as they didn't have the money to make them targets. However, in a country where being an American often equates to being seen as wealthy, his worst fears were confirmed when the leader of the gang valued Eliza's life at $1 million. Following the agent's instructions, James told the kidnappers that he wouldn't even consider paying a ransom until he was certain his daughter was alive. Although the criminals had forced Eliza to record a message for her parents, they never sent it. So James asked questions only Eliza could answer, such as the names of her grandmother and godfather. When they received the correct responses, the family was finally assured that Eliza was alive. The urgent issue then became how to raise the money. Despite the U.S. Embassy providing every possible support to the family, they were unable to offer the ransom. If the embassy were to pay $1 million for every kidnapped American, it would set a dangerous precedent. Essentially, the family only had their house, and the bank agreed to loan them $80,000 with the home as collateral. In desperation, James called his relatives in New York, and his brother and sister decided to give him all the money they had saved for retirement. James and his wife planned to sell the house afterward to repay their siblings. James informed the kidnapper that the maximum they could gather was $150,000, but the captors insisted the ransom should be closer to $1 million. With each conversation becoming shorter and more tense, the agents knew time was running out. They hurriedly began surveillance on known criminals in the region who could be suspects. Meanwhile, the family had no idea what Eliza had already endured or what lay ahead for her. By this point, she had spent 2 weeks chained to a tree, only able to move as far as the chain would allow. Exhausted and with limited mobility, she fought to stay strong, but it was becoming harder to battle her fears. Nighttime was her only solace, when she imagined she could hear her mother's voice. She found comfort in this imagined whisper, and, though she had never been particularly religious, she began to pray. Of course, Eliza had no idea that U.S. and Ecuadorian agents were hunting her kidnappers, let alone that Colombian specialists had joined the investigation. Colombians have extensive experience dealing with kidnappings, and their assistance proved invaluable. They provided high-tech equipment to track the leader of the gang's mobile phone. Naturally, there was no guarantee that he was in the same location as Eliza, but investigators had other leads to follow. The most useful lead came from Eliza herself when she asked her brother to record the SUV's license plate number. Investigators matched this number with those of vehicles captured by surveillance cameras at toll booths. They identified the vehicle used by the kidnappers, which had passed through several toll booths and was heading towards the Colombian border. During her captivity, Eliza interacted only with the 2 guards who watched over her. The leader of the gang would come and go, staying in a cabin about 50 yards from her tent, and she rarely saw him directly. The 2 guards played the classic roles of good cop and bad cop. The guard Eliza privately referred to as the good guy would bring her rice and beans and assured her that she would be released soon. In contrast, the other guard, the bad guy, threatened to kill her and her family. He also menaced that he might sell her to a larger, more dangerous group. Eliza understood that he meant FARC, an even more brutal gang experienced in holding hostages. While she was terrified, she cried alone, unwilling to show weakness to her captors, especially the one who was threatening her. It took a lot of willpower, but Eliza gradually managed to overcome her fear. She daydreamed about riding her bike, Feeling free, deciding to take action, she tried to gain the favor of the good guy guard. Indeed, he began talking to her more frequently during meals and even brought her yarn and knitting needles. She knitted 4 scarves for him, hoping to learn more about her family in exchange. He told her that her parents were alive and negotiating for her release. However, her hope was quickly dashed when the other guard openly threatened to cut off one of her fingers to increase the pressure on her parents. After 18 days of captivity, Eliza could no longer simply sit and wait for rescue. There were times when the 2 guards would wander far enough from her tent that she was only held back by a chain with a small lock. The knitting needles they had given her were too big to be of any use, but she wondered if she could find something to break the lock. Her desperation sparked creativity. The kidnappers had taken all her gadgets but left her backpack. At the bottom of the bag, she found some bobby pins. Eliza took 2 pins, bent them, and began to pick at the lock, as she had seen in movies. For the next 3 days, whenever the guards were out of sight, she worked on the lock. She tried over and over again until one day it finally clicked open. With incredible willpower, she managed to stay calm. One of the guards seemed ruthless enough to shoot her if she tried to escape, so she climbed nearby trees to get a sense of her surroundings, trying to see if there was any visible path or if the jungle was too impenetrable. Then she would return, sit down, and relock the chain. Eliza was terrified of being caught. With each attempt, she grew bolder. She had resolved to take the risk and escape from her captors. She closed her eyes, praying for guidance from her mother. At that moment, she thought she heard her mother's voice saying, "Don't risk it, don't run, wait 2 days." Eliza decided to heed the advice and wait, though not for long, as she noticed the guards' growing tension. Her time was running out. Eliza had been independent and comfortable in nature since childhood, and now she used those qualities to keep her mind occupied. She spent hours watching the trees, trying to identify the birds by their colors and songs. During the day, she reread the only book she had with her, a Colombian romance novel. But then the night would come again. The chains around her ankles prevented her from sleeping more than an hour or 2 at a time, and every rustle in the jungle could signal new danger. On the night of Saturday, November 7th, she suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and distinctly heard some sounds and saw the lights of flashlights. In the dim light, Eliza could only make out silhouettes. There were many of them, and they carried military-grade weapons. The silhouettes moved hurriedly. Eliza feared that these were FARC members. She imagined she might spend years with this group in the Colombian jungle. As the lights and shadows approached her tent, one of the men leaned in. He said something, but she couldn't hear him over her cries and pleas not to take her away. He then said that they were police officers, that they knew her father Jamie, and that they had come to rescue her. When Eliza heard her father's name, a wave of joy washed over her. She could only hope this was not a dream. The officers covered her with a bulletproof blanket and stayed with her while they conducted the operation to capture the armed kidnappers. When UNAC officers called the Levy family to inform them of Eliza's rescue, her mother, Alicia, answered the phone. Suddenly, she began to scream and jump for joy. The family describes this as the best moment of their lives, as if they could breathe freely again. They had to wait a few more hours to learn that Eliza was unharmed and safe. NAS officers brought Eliza back to Quito. Although she was eager to reunite with her family, the UNASE officials had other plans. They wanted to highlight the successful operation to rescue the hostage and encourage other families to seek police assistance without fear. To publicly showcase the moment of reunion, they held a brief press conference before introducing Eliza to her parents. After 3 weeks of anxious prayers and waiting, her family finally embraced her. As for the kidnappers, they turned out to be ordinary criminals rather than a militarized group. Eliza's testimony helped to charge the leader of the gang and the guard who had been kind to her, while the second guard managed to escape. Despite spending 3 weeks in a tiny tent, Eliza tried to maintain a positive outlook on her experience, particularly appreciating the beautiful forest that surrounded her. While no one would wish to spend 21 days in the jungle, she found it far better than being confined in a small, dark room. Her positive attitude helped her recover quickly, and she eventually became a source of strength for her family. Remarkably, just 8 weeks after returning home, Eliza embarked on a cycling trip across South America. She traveled 4,000 miles, and the local press covered her journey. She claims that the sense of freedom she experienced while cycling made the trip a healing experience for her. Late spring of 1995, Aurora, 26 years old, and Mark, 32 years old, chose the beautiful Corsican island for their honeymoon. Aurora and Mark got married 2 months ago, and the girl picked this place for their first vacation together. The young wife wanted to explore Corsica, its mountains, villages, and picturesque landscapes. On that day, they stopped in the cozy little town of Calvi. Here, the newlyweds had a candlelit dinner in the harbor at a restaurant overlooking the bay. After dinner, Aurora and Mark headed towards the Notre Dame de la Serra Chapel. It is a popular spot among tourists where lovers go to enjoy the sunset, an ideal place for a romantic end to the day. Later in the evening, around 10:30, they got into the car to return to the hotel. The young couple had to drive on a very dangerous road that sharply descended. And right at the point where the railing ended, some animal suddenly jumped onto the road in front of the car. Mark quickly turned the wheel, and the car went off the cliff. Despite the extreme situation, Aurora didn't panic. She opened the door and jumped out of the car just before it fell. Mark wasn't as fortunate. He plummeted 140 meters along with the car. Aurora was in shock, but she was alive. She made a daring decision. In the middle of the night, in pitch darkness, she descended barefoot to help her husband. Aurora found Mark in the car and pulled him out. She dragged him by the legs towards the sea and washed his face. Then, the girl climbed back up the cliff to stop a passing car and call for help. The firefighters from Calvi 1 arrived at the scene. Aurora was in hysterics, screaming and crying that her husband was down there, with a head injury and unconscious. She begged the rescuers to descend as quickly as possible and save him. The firefighters immediately headed towards the base of the cliff to find Mark, but the darkness of the night and the uneven terrain significantly hindered their search. It took them half an hour just to locate the car. It turned out to be empty. However, they noticed a lot of blood and signs indicating that the man had a severe head injury. After several hours of relentless searching, the exhausted firefighters were ready to give up when, at 6 a.m., divers signaled that they had found something. Mark's body was floating in the water right next to the car at a depth of 3 meters. They brought his body to the surface. Unfortunately, it was too late for the newlywed. The police compiled a report on another unfortunate incident on that stretch of road and closed the case. Mark's body was transported to his native Belgium. The young widow was utterly devastated. She couldn't cope with the grief on her own, and she was hospitalized in a specialized clinic for several days. Mark's relatives rushed to console her, but she shut herself off from the world, declaring that she didn't want to see anyone. Mark's family understood her state of mind and didn't insist. After all, at the age of 26, she had lost her husband during their honeymoon. But in the following days, her behavior intrigued Mark's family more and more. Gradually, concern gave way to suspicion. Aurora insisted on having her husband cremated, but his parents vehemently opposed the idea. On the day of the funeral, she shocked the family even further by leaving the farewell ceremony earlier than expected. Since then, the relationship between her and Mark's family became increasingly complicated. Upon returning to the family home, she changed the locks and didn't even let her mother-in-law, who had come to collect a few of her son's inexpensive but sentimental belongings, inside. In the following weeks, Aurora put the house up for sale. The sale of the house provided her with a sum equivalent to 125,000 euros. But that wasn't all. It turned out she had received 7 insurance payouts after her husband's death. In total, Aurora received 475,000 euros. Shocked by such behavior from their daughter-in-law, the Van Ba couple decided to take legal action and filed a complaint regarding the suspicious death, prompting the coroner to demand an investigation into the circumstances of Mark's death. To understand what actually happened that evening, investigators began by studying the lives of the couple. Approximately a year before the incident, in April 1994, 31-year-old Mark Van Ba was working at a respected financial company in Brussels. He had a wonderful job, loving parents, and friendly colleagues, and it seemed like everything in his life was going well, or almost everything. However, he had not yet met a woman with whom he wanted to spend his life. Mark was at the age when he wanted to start a family. Mark and Aurora met at a bar in Brussels. At that time, Aurora was going from door to door selling ironing boards. It was not a very profitable job. The chemistry between Mark and Aurora was instant. Mark immediately fell in love with the beautiful girl and was crazy about her. The men's friends were envious and amazed by their vibrant relationship. Aurora was very attractive, fit, and sporty, while Mark was slightly overweight, not interested in sports, and quite shy. Yet, just a few weeks after their first meeting, Aurora moved in with Mark. The future husband's family warmly welcomed her, seeing that their son was happy with her and accepting her as their future daughter-in-law and the mother of their grandchildren. No one was surprised when the young couple decided to get married after a year. The girl set several conditions for her future husband, such as asking Mark to put half of the house in her name. This might have seemed unusual or inappropriate, but Mark, deeply in love, agreed to all of the bride's terms. On March 11, 1995, the young couple said yes to each other. The husband's entire family attended the wedding, while only the bride's twin sister was present from her side. Gradually, the husband's family began to notice that their daughter-in-law never talked about her family, evasively answering all questions about her relatives, her past, or her education. She pretended to come from a more privileged family than theirs. On September 5, 1996, more than a year after Mark's death, Aurora was invited to the police station for questioning. She confirmed the statements she had previously made. She and Mark had visited a restaurant in the port and then went to a chapel. On the way back, a wild animal suddenly jumped in front of their car. Mark turned the steering wheel, and an unfortunate accident occurred. Right before the car fell off the cliff, Aurora opened the door and jumped out. The police were unable to extract any further information from her. In an attempt to uncover the truth, Mark's body was exhumed on October 8, 1996. The forensic expert noted that some of the injuries were inflicted post-mortem. Numerous wounds were found on the body, but none were bleeding. This indicates that Mark died before the car fell off the cliff. The police wanted to question the widow again, but could not locate her anywhere. The detectives then decided to investigate the crime scene in Corsica. 2 years after the incident, Belgian police officers found themselves at the edge of the ravine where the newlyweds' car had plunged. Without the car, and armed only with photographs, the task became more challenging. Nonetheless, the expert was able to reconstruct the trajectory of the car before the fall. When something happens on the road, like an animal unexpectedly running out, a person reacts by turning the steering wheel but not by a full 90 degrees. If the car veered off the road, it should have fallen into the water, and under no circumstances could it have ended up where it was found. Additionally, the expert noticed another inconsistency with the accident theory. According to the firefighters who arrived at the scene, the bushes growing on the top of the cliff were crushed. If the car had quickly descended, the bushes would have been severed. The crushed vegetation indicated that the car had stayed on the bushes for some time before slowly rolling down. Furthermore, between the car and the water, after the incident, drops of blood were found that were unevenly distributed, suggesting that the body was carried, not dragged. Could Aurora, weighing less than 50 kilograms, have carried an 80 kilograms man? The findings of the investigation did not align with Aurora's version of events. The experts' conclusions were definitive. The car was pushed off the cliff. Now, the investigators wanted to understand what happened after the incident. Did Aurora descend to help Mark? Did she find the strength and courage to climb down the rocks barefoot? As difficult as it may be to believe, it was possible. Aurora Martin was a champion rock climber, a trained athlete, so the police couldn't easily refute the possibility that she actually descended to help her husband. It was a dead end for them. Still having no news about the young woman, the investigators decided to delve deeper into her past. Who is she really? What secrets does she hide behind her evasive answers? In reality, the girl had a very difficult childhood where there was no place for a loving family or a proper education. When she was 12 years old, her parents divorced and her mother moved to Germany, and the daughter rarely saw her. She lived a carefree life with her father and 2 sisters. Her father was hardly involved in her life, and when the girl turned 18, she left her childhood home with grandiose dreams. Aurora wanted to become a model and participated in beauty contests, but without much success. So, she found work as a hostess in a bar, sometimes working as a model for an escort service. In February 1993, Aurora was 24 years old and lived life to the fullest, leveraging her beauty. One fine day, as usual, she went to a rock climbing club where a fateful encounter awaited her. Peter Schuett. He was rich, young, handsome, and shared her passion for mountaineering. He was 23 and she was 24. It was love at first sight. Next to Peter, Aurora was able to turn the page on her past life. This story seemed too miraculous to be true. Indeed, while investigating Peter's past, the investigators uncovered an unusual fact for a young man of his age. Peter Schuett was a widower. His wife had died under suspicious circumstances. It happened 2 years prior when Peter turned 21 and was serving in the German army stationed in Belgium. Peter enjoyed frequenting clubs, and one evening, while hanging out with friends, he met a young student named Ursula Deschamps. Their romance was fast-paced, and within 3 months, Peter put a ring on her finger. However, Ursula quickly discovered that Peter couldn't be satisfied with just one woman. There were other surprises awaiting her. Ursula found large sums of cash and forged documents at their home. She wanted to report her findings to the police. Tensions grew in their young marriage, and they decided to get a divorce. But on the evening of August 29, 1992, Peter and Ursula got into a convertible and set off on a trip during which Peter was supposed to teach his wife how to drive. It was a strange outing for soon-to-be ex-spouses. Peter was behind the wheel and, as usual, driving very fast. He lost control, and the car plunged into a canal at high speed. Peter managed to escape in time but couldn't save his wife, who drowned along with the car. He recalled that he even touched her hand and couldn't hold onto her to pull her to the surface. Ursula's body was found several days later. The autopsy revealed nothing that would cast doubt on the fact that the girl drowned. The police reconstructed the crime scene, and Peter convincingly demonstrated how he had escaped from the car through the rear window. Ursula's family, however, never believed it was an unfortunate accident. Firstly, it was a convertible, and Peter had never lowered the top before. Secondly, Ursula was an excellent swimmer. According to an expert who later analyzed the case, Ursula had time to escape from the car as drowning doesn't occur instantly but takes around 3 minutes as the water fills the vehicle. However, the Belgian police treated it as an unfortunate accident caused by the negligence of the driver. The young widower was sentenced to 3 months in prison, and the case was closed. 2 cases, 2 crime scenes, and 2 scenarios between which investigators couldn't help but notice coincidences. In both cases, there was a road accident, the driver lost control, and the car ended up in the water. One of the spouses managed to escape from the car in time, while the body of the other was not found in the car.
Now detectives urgently needed to find Aurora and Peter, as they became the main suspects in the case of Mark Van Ber's death. Detectives also suspected Peter of Ursula's murder, but since Peter had served 3 months in connection with that case, it was possible to forget about prosecuting him again for the same crime. Meanwhile, the police learned
Why Ursula probably died and why Peter became so wealthy. After his wife's death, he received an insurance payout equivalent to 115,000 euros. This allowed him to leave the army and seduce the beautiful Aurora. Their romance lasted for a year. But in early 1994, for unknown reasons, The young couple separated. It was during this time that the girl registered with a marriage agency. She described the ideal man as wealthy, with his own apartment, not overweight, and pleasant. April 1994 marked the beginning of her relationship with Mark Vanber. 4 months after their meeting in August 1994, the girl insured Mark. Interestingly, Mark was obviously unaware of this because the documents bore not his signature, but Aurora claimed that his hand was injured, and she signed the documents for him. Soon, an unfortunate incident occurred. Aurora sold the house, received the insurance payout, and disappeared. However, she didn't stay hidden for long. 2 months after Mark's murder, investigators found her trace in Luxembourg. She opened a bank account to deposit an amount equivalent to 475,000 euros. 2 individuals had access to the account, herself and a certain Peter Schlitt. The two reunited and moved to Miami, Florida. For almost 2 years, the lovers lived a life of luxury. Luxurious apartments, cars, and a yacht. Until a major French newspaper published an article calling them diabolical lovers and described the suspicions the police had against them. Aurora and Peter became extremely cautious. They changed their appearance and only made calls from telephone booths. They managed to hide for some time until Peter was arrested in a supermarket parking lot. He had around $50,000 with him and offered it to the police in exchange for his release, but they refused. 2 days later, the police arrested Aurora in the apartment where the lovers were hiding. Peter and Aurora did everything possible to avoid extradition. However, on December 3, 1998, they were returned to Belgium. Aurora immediately refused to give any testimony. Peter, on the other hand, spoke a lot, but little of what he said was true. Since they clearly did not want to cooperate with the investigation, the police did not have solid evidence against them. The course of the case changed due to an anonymous phone call. A woman called and revealed that she had information about Mark's murder. Later, the police identified the woman as Fabienne Lefebvre. Fabienne was Aurora's stepmother, but she had recently separated from the girl's father and decided to either seek revenge or clear her conscience. Fabienne claimed that after the tragedy in Corsica, she rushed to the hospital to comfort her stepdaughter. However, she was met by a completely different girl, not grieving at all. According to Fabienne, Aurora confessed everything to her. She stated that Peter was behind it all and that he took care of everything. When Aurora and Mark were driving on the road, Peter and 3 accomplices, his friends from Germany, stopped the car. They beat Mark with baseball bats. According to Fabienne, Mark never knew until the end who betrayed him because he begged the men to spare his wife and let her go. When the beating was over, they put Mark's body in the car and pushed it off a cliff. However, the police failed to find the accomplices or prove their existence because it didn't match Peter's character. Additionally, there were many doubts about the truthfulness of Fabienne's words. Firstly, Fabienne and Aurora had a strained relationship, and secondly, why didn't she go to the police earlier and why did she make an anonymous call? The woman claimed that she was afraid. However, the police were convinced that building a solid case based solely on Fabienne's words was not possible and sought other evidence. In Germany, the police found postcards from Corsica and photographs of the crashed car that went off the cliff in the possession of one of Peter's brothers. They were souvenir snapshots, but the intriguing part was that they were taken 6 months before Mark's murder. Was it a coincidence or careful preparation? Despite the fact that 4 years had passed since the murder, the details of the crime remained a mystery. On June 16, 1999, the police decided to reconstruct the crime scene at the airport. The driver was driving the car at a speed not exceeding 35 kilometers per hour. Aurora was supposed to open the car door wide, as if trying to jump out. She failed to do so, even when the car significantly reduced its speed. She became angry, cried, and had hysterical outbursts, trying to find an explanation for her failure. Peter intervened, attempting to defend Aurora. it is unclear why he was participating in the reconstruction at all, since theoretically he was not present during the crime in Corsica. After this experiment, the investigators were convinced that Mark Van Buren did not die as a result of an accident but was murdered. The trial began. The defendant's lawyers proposed a new version of events. Allegedly, Mark suffered a heart attack just before falling from a height. In other words, he died a few seconds before the accident, and therefore all the injuries he sustained afterwards became post-mortem. This was a hypothesis that could undermine the entire theory of prosecution. Even the forensic expert considered it a clever move, but such a version did not correspond to the autopsy results. Furthermore, during the trial, the forensic expert revealed another extremely important detail. Mark hadn't eaten anything for several hours before the crime. He was hungry. The fact that Aurora even lied about the romantic dinner with her husband that evening was the final straw for the jurors. They found both of them guilty. Aurora was sentenced to 15 years and Peter to 20 years. It is unlikely that they served even half of their sentences. They were released long ago. Despite Peter being deported to Germany and Aurora being prohibited from leaving the country, as of 2021, they were still together. Peter found work as a carpenter, and thanks to her fluency in several languages, Aurora works. The most remarkable thing about this case is that Aurora and Peter committed two almost perfect murders. And the second crime would undoubtedly have gone unnoticed if Aurora had been a little more patient and hadn't slammed the door in front of her husband's family. If she had remained the same pleasant girl they knew, she would have calmly left after a few months, and the Van Buren family would never have suspected her of anything.